The scattering of the Primarchs remains one of the most catastrophic moments in the history of the Imperium, though its full implications would not become apparent for many decades. The infant demigods, created by the Emperor through gene craft and warp science in his laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra, were torn from their gestation capsules by the machinations of the Chaos Gods. These entities, dwelling in the Imperium, recognized the threat these beings posed to their dominion and acted to subvert the Emperor's grand design. Each Primarch was cast through the warp to a different world across the galaxy, their fates left to chance and the whims of the dark gods who had orchestrated their abduction. The infant who would become known as Lorgar Aurelian materialized on Colchis, a desert world located in the galactic east. Unlike some of his brothers who arrived on worlds of relative civilization or fell into the hands of those who would nurture their potential, Lorgar's landing site was among the most inhospitable regions of an already harsh planet. The desert wastes of Colchis were brutal expanses of sun-scorched sand and rock, where few ventured and fewer still survived for long. It was in this desolate landscape that the priest Corferon discovered the child. Corferon was no ordinary wanderer. He served as a priest within the Covenant, the dominant theocratic power that ruled much of Colchis. The Covenant maintained its authority through strict religious doctrine and the enforcement of worship directed toward the entities they called the Old Powers. Corferon had been traveling through the desert on a pilgrimage when he encountered the strange child. Even at this early stage, the infant displayed characteristics that marked him as fundamentally different from normal humans. His size alone would have been remarkable, but there was something else, an indefinable quality that suggested greatness or perhaps danger. The priest's decision to take the child rather than leave him to die or report him to the Covenant authorities would prove to be one of the most consequential choices in galactic history. Corferon named the boy Lorgar, and despite his position within the Covenant hierarchy, he raised the child in relative secrecy. The priest was ambitious and calculating, traits that had served him well in the political machinations of Colchis's theocratic society. In Lorgar, he recognized an opportunity, though perhaps even he could not have imagined the full scope of what this strange foundling would become. Lorgar's development was extraordinary even by Primarch standards. He grew at an accelerated rate, his body maturing far faster than any normal human child. But his physical growth was matched and perhaps exceeded by the development of his mind. From an early age, Lorgar demonstrated abilities that went beyond mere intelligence. He possessed a form of psychic empathy that allowed him to sense the emotions and spiritual states of those around him. This gift, or curse depending on one's perspective, gave him an intimate understanding of human nature and the deep-seated need for meaning and purpose that drove people's actions. The young Primarch's oratory skills manifested early and powerfully. When Lorgar spoke, people listened. His words carried a weight and conviction that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to something deeper within his audience. This was not simple charisma, though he possessed that in abundance. There was something almost supernatural in his ability to inspire faith and devotion through speech alone. Corferon, ever the opportunist, recognized the value of this gift and encouraged its development, though he also sought to control and direct it for his own purposes. Colchis itself was a world defined by religious conflict. The Covenant, with its worship of what they termed the Old Powers, held dominance over much of the planet's population. Their doctrine was enforced through a combination of genuine belief, political power, and when necessary, violence. The priests of the Covenant maintained that the Old Powers were divine entities worthy of worship and obedience, and they structured Colchian society around elaborate rituals and observances dedicated to these beings. However, the Covenant's authority was not absolute. Scattered across Colchis were practitioners of what was called the Old Faith, a different religious tradition that predated the Covenant's rise to power. These believers maintained their own practices and rejected the Covenant's theology, viewing the Old Powers as false or even malevolent. The tension between these two religious factions created an undercurrent of violence and persecution that defined much of Colchian life. The Covenant viewed the Old Faith as heresy and treated its practitioners accordingly, while the faithful of the old ways resisted as best they could, often at great cost. Lorgar's position within this religious landscape was complicated by his unique abilities and insights. As he matured, he began to experience visions, powerful psychic impressions that showed him truths about the nature of the universe and the entities that the Covenant worshipped. What he saw disturbed him profoundly. The old powers that the Covenant revered were not benevolent gods deserving of worship. Through his visions, Lorgar perceived their true nature as parasitic entities that fed upon human suffering and devotion. They were the chaos gods, though he may not have understood them in those terms at the time. This revelation created a fundamental crisis for the young Primarch. He had been raised within the Covenant's traditions, educated in their doctrines by Khor-Pharon himself. Yet his visions and his innate understanding of spiritual matters told him that everything the Covenant taught was built upon a foundation of lies. The entities they worshipped were not worthy of devotion, but were instead corrupting forces that twisted and degraded those who gave themselves over to them. Khor-Pharon's reaction to Lorgar's growing doubts and his rejection of Covenant doctrine was complex. The priest had invested years in raising and shaping the boy, and he had his own plans for how Lorgar's gifts might be used to advance his position within the Covenant hierarchy. Lorgar's denunciation of the old powers threatened these ambitions, yet Khor-Pharon also recognized that he could not simply force the Primarch to comply. Lorgar's conviction was too strong, his certainty too absolute. The priest adapted, choosing to align himself with his adoptive son's new path rather than lose his influence entirely. Lorgar's rejection of the Covenant's gods left him with a spiritual void that demanded filling. A being of his nature could not exist without faith. The need for belief, for something greater than himself to serve and worship, was fundamental to his character. It was during this period of spiritual searching that Lorgar experienced visions of a different kind. He saw a golden figure, a being of immense power and majesty, who represented everything the old powers were not. This figure embodied order, enlightenment, and the potential for humanity to rise above its base nature and achieve greatness. Lorgar became convinced that this golden figure was the true God worthy of worship, the one genuine divine entity in a universe of false idols and malevolent spirits. He began to preach this new faith, speaking of the God who would come to unite humanity and lead it to a glorious destiny. His words, empowered by his psychic gifts and his absolute conviction, began to attract followers. People who heard Lorgar speak felt the truth of his message in ways they could not fully articulate. His faith became their faith, and his certainty gave them certainty. The unification of Colchis under Lorgar's banner was unlike the typical pattern followed by most of his brother Primarchs, where many united their worlds through conquest and military might, demonstrating their superiority through martial prowess. Lorgar achieved his unification primarily through faith. He did not lead armies of conquest, but rather movements of believers. His followers spread his message across Colchis, converting others through the power of their conviction and the compelling nature of Lorgar's vision. This is not to say that violence played no role in Colchis's unification. The Covenant did not relinquish its power willingly, and conflicts erupted between the old religious order and Lorgar's growing movement. But these conflicts were religious wars rather than campaigns of territorial expansion. Those who opposed Lorgar did so not because they rejected his political authority, but because they rejected his theological claims. And increasingly, they found themselves on the losing side of these confrontations, as more and more of Colchis's population embraced the new faith. Khor-Pharon remained at Lorgar's side throughout this period, adapting his own beliefs, or at least his professed beliefs, to align with his adoptive son's vision. Other figures joined Lorgar's inner circle as well, individuals who would later play significant roles in the events that shaped the galaxy. The structure that Lorgar built on Colchis was fundamentally religious in nature, a theocracy dedicated to the worship of the god he had seen in his visions. The golden figure he believed would come to claim his rightful place as humanity's divine ruler. When Lorgar finally achieved dominance over Colchis, he did not rest on his accomplishments. Instead, he prepared his world and his followers for the arrival of the god he had promised them. He constructed great monuments and cathedrals, established religious orders and hierarchies, and ensured that every aspect of Colchisian society reflected devotion to the divine figure he worshipped. The planet became a monument to faith itself, every structure and institution designed to glorify the god who was to come. The arrival of the Great Crusade at Colchis would prove Lorgar correct in ways that both validated and ultimately complicated his faith. The Emperor of Mankind, the being Lorgar had seen in his visions and proclaimed as divine, came to Colchis not as a conqueror, but as a father reclaiming his lost son. The Emperor's arrival on Colchis marked the culmination of Lorgar's lifelong faith and the beginning of complications that would ultimately doom the galaxy to civil war. The Master of Mankind came to the desert world with a fleet that spoke of power beyond anything Colchis had ever witnessed. His vessels hung in orbit like celestial monuments, and when he descended to the planet's surface, he came as both conqueror and father. The reunion between the Emperor and his 17th son was unlike most of the other Primarch discoveries in one critical aspect: Lorgar had been expecting him. When the Emperor stood before Lorgar for the first time, the Primarch's reaction was immediate and absolute. He prostrated himself before his father, pressing his forehead to the ground in an act of complete submission and worship. This was not the measured respect that some of his brothers had shown, nor was it the cautious evaluation that others had displayed upon meeting their creator. Lorgar worshipped the Emperor in that moment with the same fervent devotion he had preached to the people of Colchis for years. Everything he had promised, every vision he had experienced, every sermon he had delivered about the coming of the divine God Emperor had been vindicated. The golden figure from his vision stood before him in flesh and reality. The Emperor's response to this veneration was one of visible discomfort. He had not created the Primarchs to be worshippers, but to be generals, administrators, and leaders of his great project to unite humanity under the banner of imperial truth. This philosophy explicitly rejected religious belief and superstition, viewing such things as remnants of humanity's ignorant past that had no place in the rational, enlightened future he intended to build. The Emperor attempted to raise Lorgar from his prostration, speaking to him of duty and purpose rather than divinity. But the damage, if it could be called that, was already done. Lorgar's faith was not something that could be reasoned away or dismissed through logical argument. It was fundamental to his nature, woven into the very fabric of his being. The Emperor, despite his discomfort with Lorgar's worship, recognized the value of what his son had accomplished on Colchis. The planet was unified and compliant, its population ready to contribute to the imperial war machine and the Great Crusade. More importantly, here was another of his lost sons returned to him, another piece of his grand design restored. Whatever concerns he had about Lorgar's religious fervor were apparently outweighed by the practical benefits of having another Primarch leading his armies. The Emperor gave Lorgar command of the 17th Legion, the Astartes warriors who had been fighting in the Great Crusade without their Gene Father's guidance. The 17th Legion had previously been known as the Imperial Heralds, a name that reflected their role in announcing the coming of the Imperium to newly discovered human worlds. They had compiled a respectable record of conquests and compliance actions, though they had not distinguished themselves as dramatically as some of the other legions. When Lorgar assumed command, he immediately began reshaping the legion in his image, transforming it from a military force into something that more closely resembled a holy order. The first and most visible change was the renaming of the legion. The Imperial Heralds became the word bearers, a title that reflected their new purpose as spreaders of faith rather than mere military conquerors. This was not simply a cosmetic change, but represented a fundamental shift in how the Legion understood its mission. Where the Imperial Heralds had brought compliance through force of arms and the authority of the Imperium, the word-bearers would bring something deeper, true belief in the imperial cause and worship of the Emperor as the rightful god of humanity. Lorgar imported wholesale the religious practices and organizational structures he had developed on Colchis. The word-bearers' legion became suffused with ritual and ceremony. Before battles, the Astartes would engage in lengthy prayers and devotions. After victories, they would construct monuments and temples to commemorate their achievements and glorify the Emperor. The legion's chaplains, who in other legions served primarily as morale officers and keepers of tradition, became central figures in the word-bearers, leading religious observances and ensuring doctrinal purity among the battle brothers. The integration of Colchian officers into the legion's command structure was another significant change. Cor Ferron, Lorgar's adoptive father, was given a position of tremendous authority despite the fact that he was not a true Astartes. The process of transformation into a space marine required specific genetic compatibility and was most successful when performed on adolescent subjects. Corferon was far too old for the standard procedures, but he underwent partial augmentation that enhanced his physical capabilities without fully transforming him into an Astartes. His role in the Legion was formalized as Master of the Faith, a position that gave him authority over the spiritual and doctrinal aspects of the Word-Bearer's operations. Notably, he never held the title of First Captain, a distinction that separated him from the traditional military hierarchy while still granting him immense influence. Erebus, who had been among Lorgar's earliest followers on Colchis, was elevated to the position of First Chaplain. Unlike Corferon, Erebus was young enough to undergo the full transformation into an Astartes, and he became one of the Word-Bearer's most capable warriors, as well as one of its most fervent believers. His role as First Chaplain made him responsible for the spiritual welfare of the entire Legion, a position he used to spread Lorgar's interpretation of Imperial doctrine throughout the ranks. Erebus would prove to be one of the most influential figures in the Legion's history, though the full extent of his impact would not become apparent until much later. The Word-Bearer's approach to the Great Crusade differed markedly from that of their brother legions, where forces like the Luna Wolves or the Ultramarines prioritized rapid conquest and efficient compliance. The Word-Bearers took their time with each world they brought into the Imperium. Lorgar insisted that true compliance was not simply a matter of military defeat and administrative integration. A world was not truly compliant until its population understood and embraced the imperial truth, until they worshipped the Emperor as Lorgar himself did. This methodology manifested in the Word-Bearers spending months or even years on worlds that other legions would have considered compliant after weeks of fighting. After military resistance was crushed, the Legion would remain to oversee the construction of massive temple cathedrals dedicated to the Emperor. These structures were not simple monuments, but elaborate complexes that served as centers of worship and education. The Word-Bearers would preach to the local populations, converting them to the faith that Lorgar preached. They established priesthoods and religious hierarchies, ensuring that even after the Legion departed, the world would maintain its devotion to the Emperor. The architecture of these temple cathedrals reflected Colchian aesthetic sensibilities combined with imperial grandeur. They featured soaring spires, vast halls capable of holding thousands of worshippers, and intricate iconography depicting the Emperor in various aspects of his divinity. Some incorporated local architectural traditions, adapted to serve the purposes of imperial worship. The Word-Bearers took pride in these constructions, viewing them as their greatest contribution to the Imperium. Each cathedral was a permanent testament to their faith and their dedication to spreading the Emperor's glory. This thorough approach to compliance had predictable effects on the Word-Bearers' conquest rate. They fell behind the pace set by other legions, bringing fewer worlds into compliance over the same periods of time. From Lorgar's perspective, this was not a failing but a virtue. He argued that the worlds the Word-Bearers brought into the Imperium were more securely held, their populations genuinely devoted to the imperial cause rather than simply cowed by military might. A world conquered by the Word-Bearers would not rebel the moment imperial forces departed because its people had been transformed into true believers. The Legion's methods also affected its internal culture in ways that distinguished it from other Astartes forces. The Word-Bearers developed an intense focus on literacy and learning, particularly regarding religious texts and imperial history. Every battle brother was expected to be not just a warrior, but a scholar and preacher capable of articulating the faith to others. The Legion maintained extensive libraries aboard its ships, filled with religious texts, philosophical treatises, and historical records. These collections grew with each world the Word-Bearers conquered, incorporating local religious traditions that could be adapted to serve imperial worship. The training regimens for Word-Bearers initiates included substantial theological education alongside the standard martial instruction. Aspirants learned to recite lengthy passages from approved texts, to construct compelling arguments for the Emperor's divinity, and to conduct religious ceremonies with proper solemnity and precision. This emphasis on intellectual and spiritual development did not come at the expense of martial prowess. The word-bearers remained formidable warriors, capable of matching any other legion in battle, but they understood their role as encompassing more than simple combat effectiveness. Relations between the word-bearers and other legions during this period were complex. Some Primarchs and their forces viewed Lorgar's methods with skepticism or outright disapproval. The emphasis on religion ran counter to the imperial truth that the Emperor had proclaimed, even if Lorgar's religion centered on worship of the Emperor himself. Legions that prioritized efficiency and rapid conquest saw the word-bearers' slow, methodical approach as a failing. Others simply found the overt religiosity distasteful or unnecessary. However, the word-bearers also had their defenders and admirers. Some imperial commanders appreciated the stability that Lorgar's methods brought to conquered worlds. Populations converted by the word-bearers required less ongoing military presence to keep them compliant, freeing up resources for use elsewhere. The elaborate cathedrals the Legion constructed became sources of pride for many worlds, monuments that elevated their status within the growing Imperium. And there were those within the Imperium who, despite the official doctrine of the imperial truth, found the religious certainty that Lorgar offered appealing. Lorgar himself seemed largely unconcerned with criticism from his brothers or other imperial officials. His faith in the Emperor was absolute, and he believed that his methods served his father's interests better than the purely military approaches favored by other legions. When questioned about the slow pace of his conquests, he would respond with arguments about the quality of compliance versus mere quantity. He genuinely believed that he was fulfilling the Emperor's vision more faithfully than those who simply conquered and moved on. The Primarch's relationship with his father during this period was characterized by a fundamental misunderstanding that would have catastrophic consequences. Lorgar interpreted the Emperor's tolerance of his methods as tacit approval, perhaps even pleasure at having a son who recognized his divine nature. The Emperor, for his part, seems to have initially viewed Lorgar's religiosity as a phase that would pass, or at least moderate over time. The Master of Mankind was focused on the broader strategic picture of the Great Crusade, and as long as the word-bearers continued to bring worlds into compliance, the specific methods they used may have seemed less important than the overall progress of imperial expansion. The construction of Monarchia represented the absolute pinnacle of Lorgar's vision for what the Imperium should become. Located on the world of Kur in the Viridia system, this temple city was not simply another monument to the Emperor among many. It was intended to be the perfect expression of faith made manifest in architecture and urban planning, a city where every structure, every street, every public space existed to glorify the Master of Mankind. The word-bearers had spent decades building Monarchia, pouring resources and labor into its construction on a scale that dwarfed even their previous ambitious projects. The city sprawled across the desert landscape of Kur, its white marble structures gleaming under the system's sun. At its heart stood the Grand Cathedral, a structure so massive that it could accommodate hundreds of thousands of worshippers simultaneously. The cathedral's central dome rose higher than any other building on Kur, visible from orbit as a brilliant white jewel set into the planet's surface. Surrounding this central structure were countless smaller temples, shrines, and devotional spaces, each dedicated to different aspects of the Emperor's glory. The word-bearers had integrated their Colchisian architectural traditions with techniques learned from dozens of conquered worlds, creating a unique synthesis that they believed represented the future of imperial culture. The streets of Monarchia were laid out in patterns that held religious significance, forming symbols and glyphs that could only be fully appreciated from above. Public squares featured statuary depicting the Emperor in various heroic poses, each statue carved from single blocks of imported stone by artisans who had spent years perfecting their craft. The residential districts were designed to facilitate community worship, with neighborhoods centered around local temples where citizens could gather for daily devotions. Even the city's infrastructure served religious purposes, with aqueducts and water features designed to create specific acoustic effects that enhanced the experience of prayer and meditation. The population of Monarchia consisted primarily of Curian natives who had embraced the faith the word-bearers brought, along with pilgrims from other worlds the Legion had brought into compliance. These citizens did not simply live in Monarchia, they dedicated their lives to its maintenance and the perpetuation of worship within its walls. The city functioned as both a population center and a vast temple complex, with the distinction between sacred and secular space effectively erased. Every citizen was, in a sense, a priest or priestess, their daily labor contributing to the greater purpose of glorifying the emperor. Lorgar visited Monarchia regularly, using it as a base of operations when the word-bearers were campaigning in nearby systems. He would deliver sermons in the Grand Cathedral to crowds that filled every available space, his words amplified by carefully designed acoustics so that even those in the furthest reaches of the building could hear him clearly. These sermons could last for hours, with Lorgar expounding on the nature of the Emperor's divinity, the purpose of the Great Crusade, and the duty of all humanity to recognize and worship their God. The Primarch viewed these gatherings as among his most important work, more vital than any military campaign. However, while Lorgar saw Monarchia as his greatest achievement, others within the Imperium viewed it with growing concern. The word-bearers' conquest rate had continued to lag significantly behind other legions. Where Horus and the Luna Wolves, or Guilliman and the Ultramarines, brought dozens of worlds into compliance each year, the word-bearers' numbers remained stubbornly low. The time and resources devoted to projects like Monarchia were time and resources not spent expanding the Imperium's borders. Military planners and logistics officers noted with frustration that the word-bearers consistently required more support and supplies than other legions, while producing fewer tangible results in terms of conquered territory. The other Primarchs had varying reactions to their brothers' methods and priorities. Some, like Guilliman, viewed the situation with practical disapproval. The Ultramarines Primarch was a master of efficient governance and military logistics, and from his perspective, the word-bearers were squandering their potential. Every day spent constructing temples was a day not spent bringing new worlds into the Imperium, and the Great Crusade's success depended on maintaining momentum. Other Primarchs were more concerned with the religious aspects of Lorgar's work. The Emperor had proclaimed the imperial truth, a philosophy that explicitly rejected religious belief and superstition. Yet here was one of his own sons not only practicing religion, but spreading it throughout the Imperium on a massive scale. The Emperor himself had been aware of Lorgar's religious devotion since their reunion on Colchis, but for decades he had not directly intervened. The reasons for this initial tolerance remain a subject of speculation among imperial historians. Perhaps he believed that Lorgar would eventually moderate his views as he gained more experience with the broader Imperium. Perhaps the demands of the Great Crusade meant that the Emperor's attention was focused on more immediate strategic concerns. Or perhaps he initially underestimated how deeply Lorgar's faith ran and how effectively the word-bearers would spread their worship throughout the worlds they conquered. Whatever the reasons for the Emperor's previous restraint, by the time Monarchia reached completion, his patience had reached its end. The Master of Mankind had created the Primarchs to be tools of his grand vision for humanity, instruments through which he would unite the scattered fragments of human civilization under rational, enlightened rule. Lorgar's transformation of the word-bearers into a religious order and his construction of vast temple cities directly contradicted this vision. The Emperor decided that a dramatic intervention was necessary, not just to correct Lorgar's behavior, but to send a message to the entire Imperium about the unacceptability of religious worship. The Emperor's decision to personally oversee Lorgar's rebuke demonstrated how seriously he took the situation. The Master of Mankind rarely involved himself directly in the discipline of his sons, typically leaving such matters to be handled through normal chains of command. His presence at Kur would ensure that no one could misunderstand the message being delivered. Accompanying him was Malkador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest advisor, and one of the few individuals whose counsel the Master of Mankind consistently sought. Malcador's presence added additional weight to the proceedings, signaling that this was not a simple military matter, but a fundamental issue of imperial policy. The choice of Roboute Guilliman and the Ultramarines to carry out the actual destruction of Monarchia was calculated and deliberate. Guilliman represented everything that Lorgar was not: efficient, practical, focused on measurable results rather than abstract ideals. The Ultramarines were the most successful legion in terms of compliance counts, having brought more worlds into the Imperium than any other force. By selecting Guilliman for this task, the Emperor was making a clear statement about which approach to the Great Crusade he valued. The choice also ensured that the destruction would be carried out with characteristic Ultramarine thoroughness and precision. The Ultramarines arrived at Kur in force, their fleet assuming orbit around the planet with overwhelming military superiority. Guilliman himself led the operation, though records suggest he took no pleasure in the task. The Ultramarines' Primarch understood the necessity of following orders and maintaining discipline within the legions, but destroying a city that had taken decades to build, a city filled with loyal imperial citizens, was not the kind of victory he preferred. Nevertheless, he carried out his orders with the efficiency expected of him. The bombardment of Monarchia was methodical and complete. Ultramarines' vessels in orbit used precise lance strikes and macro cannon fire to reduce the city's structures to rubble. The Grand Cathedral, which had taken years to construct and stood as the centerpiece of Lorgar's vision, was obliterated in minutes. The carefully planned streets and public spaces were torn apart by explosions. The statuary that had been crafted with such care was shattered into fragments. The Ultramarines did not simply damage Monarchia, they erased it, ensuring that nothing remained that could serve as a rallying point for continued worship. The civilian population had been evacuated before the bombardment began, spared from physical harm but forced to watch as their city was destroyed. For the citizens of Monarchia, many of whom had devoted their entire lives to the city's construction and maintenance, the destruction was spiritually devastating. They had believed that their work glorified the Emperor, that they were serving his will through their devotion. Now they witnessed the Emperor's own warriors methodically destroying everything they had built. The Word-Bearer's Legion was summoned to Kur to witness the aftermath. Every company, every squad, every individual battle brother who could be recalled from active duty was brought to the ruined city. They arrived to find Monarchia reduced to ash and broken stone, the white marble that had gleamed so brilliantly now blackened and shattered. The Ultramarines had withdrawn to a perimeter around the ruins, their presence ensuring that the Word-Bearers understood this was not a natural disaster or enemy action, but a deliberate imperial operation. Then came the moment that would define Lorgar's future, and ultimately, the fate of the galaxy. The Emperor himself descended to Kur's surface, accompanied by Malcador and a contingent of custodian guard. The Master of Mankind appeared before the assembled Word-Bearers in his full glory, his psychic presence overwhelming even at a distance. The Emperor commanded that the entire legion kneel in the ashes of Monarchia, and the Word-Bearers complied. Thousands of Astartes warriors, gene-crafted super soldiers who knew no fear in battle, prostrated themselves in the ruins of their greatest achievement. Lorgar knelt at the forefront of his legion, his face pressed into the ash-covered ground. The Primarch who had spent his entire life worshipping the Emperor, who had unified Calcus through faith, who had transformed his legion into an instrument of religious devotion, now knelt before the object of his worship and received not blessing but condemnation. The Emperor's words were devastating in their clarity and finality. He declared that there were no gods, only men. The imperial truth rejected all forms of religious belief as primitive superstition. The Emperor was not divine and did not desire worship. He was simply the most advanced and capable human being, using his abilities to guide humanity toward a rational, enlightened future. The Emperor's rebuke extended beyond simple theological correction. He condemned the Word-Bearers' slow progress in the Great Crusade, pointing to their poor compliance numbers as evidence of failed priorities. While other legions expanded the Imperium's borders and brought the light of human civilization to distant worlds, the Word-Bearers had wasted time and resources building monuments to delusions. The destruction of Monarchia was intended as an object lesson, a demonstration of what happened when the emperor's clear instructions were ignored in favor of religious fantasy. The forced kneeling lasted for hours, with the word-bearers remaining prostrate in the ruins, while the emperor's words echoed across the dead city. Some accounts suggest that Lorgar wept openly, tears mixing with the ash that covered his face. Others report that he remained silent and still, his psychic presence dimmed to almost nothing, as though he had withdrawn entirely into himself. The rest of the legion maintained their positions without complaint, their discipline holding despite the humiliation of the situation. The Ultramarines watched from their positions around the perimeter, witnesses to their brother legion's disgrace. When the Emperor finally departed, leaving the word-bearers still kneeling in Monarchia's ruins, he took with him any possibility of Lorgar maintaining his previous faith. The Primarch had built his entire existence around worship of the Emperor as the one true God. Every decision he had made since arriving on Colchis, every structure he had ordered built, every sermon he had delivered, had been in service to this belief. Now the Emperor himself had declared it all false, had destroyed the physical manifestation of Lorgar's faith, and commanded him to abandon his delusions. The word-bearers eventually rose from the ashes of Monarchia and returned to their ships. The Legion's demeanor had changed fundamentally. The certainty and fervor that had characterized them was replaced by confusion and a sense of betrayal. They had believed they were serving the emperors more faithfully than any other legion, that their devotion set them apart as the most loyal of all the Astartes forces. Instead, they had been publicly humiliated and their greatest work destroyed. The questions that plagued them had no easy answers. If the emperor was not divine, what was the purpose of the Great Crusade? If faith was mere superstition, what meaning did their service have? Lorgar retreated into seclusion following the destruction of Monarchia, spending weeks in meditation and contemplation. The Primarch, who had never doubted, whose certainty had inspired millions to embrace his faith, now faced a spiritual crisis that threatened to break him entirely. His adoptive father, Cor-Ferran, and his first chaplain, Erebus, attended him during this period, though what counsel they offered remains largely unknown. What is certain is that Lorgar emerged from his seclusion changed, his previous faith shattered, but his need for belief undiminished. The weeks following Monarchia's destruction marked the darkest period in Lorgar's existence. The Primarch, who had never known doubt now, found himself adrift in a universe that seemed suddenly devoid of meaning. His quarters aboard the flagship became a place of isolation where he wrestled with questions that had no answers within the framework of the imperial truth. If the Emperor was not divine, then what was he? If worship was mere superstition, then why had Lorgar been created with such an overwhelming need to believe? The contradiction between his nature and the Emperor's rejection of his devotion created a wound that rational thought could not heal. Cor-Ferran and Erebus maintained constant attendance during this period, though they allowed Lorgar the space he needed for contemplation. The two Colchians had their own perspectives on the events at Monarchia, perspectives shaped by their origins on a world where the old powers had once held sway. While Lorgar had rejected the Covenant's worship of those entities decades ago, Cor-Ferran and Erebus had never fully abandoned their understanding of the forces that dwelt beyond the material realm. They had simply redirected their devotion toward the Emperor, following Lorgar's light. Now, with that devotion rejected, they began to reconsider what they had left behind. The conversations between the three began cautiously, with Cor-Ferran and Erebus introducing concepts from ancient Colchian texts that Lorgar had long dismissed as corrupted lies. These texts spoke of powers that existed beyond the physical universe, entities of immense capability that could grant knowledge and strength to those who understood their nature. The Covenant had called them the Old Powers and worshipped them as gods. Lorgar had seen through his visions that they were parasitic and corrupting forces, but Cor-Ferran now posed a different question. What if the corruption came not from the powers themselves, but from ignorance about their true nature? Erebus proved particularly persuasive in these discussions, arguing that Lorgar's visions on Colchis had shown him truth, but that he had interpreted that truth through the lens of his devotion to the Emperor. The entities in the warp were powerful, yes, and they fed on human emotion and belief, but was that fundamentally different from what the Emperor did? The master of mankind commanded the devotion of billions, shaped human society according to his will, and used humanity as tools for his grand design. Perhaps the difference between the Emperor and the powers in the warp was not one of kind, but merely of degree and method. Lorgar resisted these arguments initially. His rejection of the Covenant's gods had been absolute, based on genuine spiritual insight rather than simple disagreement over doctrine. But the destruction of Monarchia had shattered his certainty about everything. If he had been so fundamentally wrong about the Emperor's nature and desires, perhaps he had been wrong about other things as well. The need for faith that defined his existence demanded an outlet, and with worship of the Emperor forbidden, Lorgar found himself considering possibilities he would have rejected without hesitation mere months earlier. The ancient texts that Corferon produced came from his personal collection, documents he had preserved from his days as a priest of the Covenant. These were not the crude devotional materials used to control Culcus's masses, but deeper theological and philosophical works that attempted to understand the nature of the warp and the entities that dwelt within it. The texts described the warp not as a separate dimension, but as a reflection of the material universe, a realm where thought and emotion took on concrete form. The powers that existed there were born from the collective psychic emanations of sentient beings, growing stronger as they fed on the emotions that resonated with their nature. What struck Lorgar most forcefully was the text's description of the relationship between the material and immaterial realms. The powers in the warp were not simply parasites feeding on humanity. They were part of a cosmic cycle where emotion and belief in the material realm created entities in the warp, which in turn influenced the material realm through their actions. This was not corruption in the simple sense that Lorgar had understood it on Culcus. It was a fundamental aspect of reality itself, as natural and inevitable as gravity or entropy. The texts also contained references to the Emperor that Lorgar found deeply troubling. They suggested that the Master of Mankind had created the Primarchs using power drawn from the warp, that he had made bargains or arrangements with the entities there to fuel his own ascension to godlike status. If this was true, then the Emperor's rejection of the warp powers was not based on their inherent evil, but on his desire to monopolize their strength for his own purposes. The imperial truth, viewed through this lens, was not enlightenment, but a lie designed to prevent humanity from accessing sources of power that might challenge the Emperor's supremacy. Lorgar could not immediately accept these claims, but neither could he dismiss them entirely. His psychic abilities allowed him to sense truth and falsehood in ways that normal humans could not, and the texts resonated with something deep within his understanding of the universe. The destruction of Monarchia had proven that his interpretation of the Emperor's nature was flawed. Perhaps his interpretation of the warp powers had been equally mistaken, colored by his devotion to the Emperor rather than based on objective spiritual insight. The decision to undertake a pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror was not made lightly or quickly. Lorgar spent months studying the Colchian texts, cross-referencing them with other sources that the word-bearers had accumulated during the Great Crusade. The Eye of Terror was known to the Imperium as a region of extreme warp instability, a place where the barrier between material and immaterial reality had effectively collapsed. Ships that entered the Eye rarely returned, and those that did brought back reports of impossible phenomena and crew members driven mad by what they had witnessed. It was precisely the kind of place where truth about the warp's nature might be found, if one could survive the experience. Corferon and Erebus supported the pilgrimage concept enthusiastically, though their motivations may have differed from Lorgar's stated goal of seeking truth. The two Colchians had their own agendas, shaped by decades of political maneuvering and personal ambition. A journey into the Eye of Terror offered possibilities for gaining knowledge and power that would elevate their positions within the Legion and perhaps within the broader Imperium. They helped Lorgar plan the expedition, identifying which ships and which warriors should accompany the Primarch on this dangerous journey. The selection of participants was carefully considered. Lorgar could not take the entire word-bearer's legion into the Eye without raising immediate suspicion from Imperial authorities. The Legion was already under increased scrutiny following Monarchia's destruction, and disappearing entirely into a warp anomaly would trigger investigations that could expose the pilgrimage's true purpose. Instead, Lorgar chose a single chapter of the Legion, approximately 1,000 warriors who would serve as both explorers and, if necessary, defenders during the journey into the immaterial realm. This chapter was known as the Serrated Sun, a formation that had distinguished itself in numerous campaigns and whose leadership Lorgar trusted implicitly. The chapter's commander was a veteran officer who had served since the Legion's earliest days, and his company captains were warriors of proven faith and capability. More importantly, they were word-bearers who had felt the humiliation of monarchia most acutely, who understood that something fundamental had broken in their relationship with the Emperor and the Imperium. These were men who would follow Lorgar into the warp itself if he commanded it, and that was precisely what he intended to do. Among the Serrated Sun's ranks were several warriors who would later become known as the Gal Vorbak, though at the time of the pilgrimage's beginning, they were simply veteran Astartes chosen for their strength and dedication. Argel Tal, a captain within the chapter, was among the most notable of these warriors. He had served Lorgar since the Primarch's earliest campaigns, and his loyalty to his Gene father was absolute. Argel Tal had been present at Monarchia's destruction, had knelt in the ashes alongside his brothers, and had felt the same confusion and betrayal that plagued the entire Legion. When Lorgar approached him about the pilgrimage, Argel Tal accepted without hesitation, driven by his own need to understand what had happened and what the future held. The preparations for the journey were conducted with utmost secrecy. The word-bearers claimed they were undertaking a penance crusade, a period of renewed military focus to prove their worth to the Emperor and the Imperium following their failure at Monarchia. This explanation satisfied Imperial authorities who were primarily concerned with seeing the word-bearers' compliance numbers improve. The Serrated Sun departed from the main Legion fleet with minimal ceremony, their ship setting course for the galactic northeast, where the Eye of Terror dominated local space like a wound in reality. The journey toward the Eye took weeks, during which Lorgar spent much of his time in meditation and study. He prepared himself mentally and spiritually for what lay ahead, knowing that the warp would test him in ways that physical combat never could. His psychic abilities, which he had always possessed but never fully explored, would be crucial for navigating the immaterial realm and interpreting whatever truths he discovered there. Cor Ferron and Erebus conducted their own preparations, leading the Serrated Sun's warriors in rituals adapted from Colchissian practices, ceremonies designed to strengthen their minds against the warp's corrupting influence. As the word-bearers' fleet approached the Eye of Terror, the effects of the warp's presence became increasingly apparent. Reality itself seemed less stable, with ship systems reporting impossible readings and crew members experiencing vivid dreams and waking visions. The Eye dominated the view screens, a massive swirling vortex of colors that should not exist in nature, spanning light years of space. Looking at it directly caused physical discomfort, a sense of wrongness that bypassed rational thought and triggered instinctive revulsion. This was the destination Lorgar had chosen, the place where he hoped to find answers to questions that the Emperor had forbidden him to ask. The transition from normal space into the Eye was not a clean process. Ships did not simply cross a boundary and find themselves in a different environment. Instead, the passage was gradual and disorienting, with the laws of physics becoming increasingly unreliable as the fleet penetrated deeper into the anomaly. Time lost its linear progression, with moments stretching into subjective hours or compressing into instants. The Geller fields that normally protected ships during warp travel strained under the pressure of the Eye's reality warping effects, and tech priests reported fluctuations that should have been impossible with properly functioning equipment. The word-bearers experienced the transition as a form of spiritual awakening. The psychic pressure within the Eye was immense, far beyond anything they had encountered during normal warp travel. Those with even minor psychic sensitivity found themselves bombarded with impressions and sensations that had no correlation to physical stimuli. They saw colors that did not exist in the normal spectrum, heard sounds that conveyed meaning without language, and felt presences watching them from directions that geometry could not accommodate. For warriors trained to face any physical threat without fear, the experience was profoundly unsettling. Lorgar, however, did not experience fear. His psychic abilities allowed him to process the warp's influence in ways his sons could not, and what they perceived as chaotic madness, he began to recognize as a different form of order. The warp was not random or meaningless. It followed its own logic, its own patterns and structures that simply did not correspond to material reality. The entities that dwelt here were not monsters in the conventional sense, but expressions of fundamental forces, concepts given form and consciousness through the psychic emanations of living beings across the galaxy. The first true contact with demonic entities came when the fleet had been within the eye for what the ship's chronometers claimed was 3 days, though subjective experience suggested either much less or much more time had passed. The demons did not attack in the manner of conventional enemies. Instead, they appeared aboard the word-bearers' vessels as manifestations of warp energy, taking forms that reflected the fears and desires of those who perceived them. Some appeared as beautiful figures offering knowledge and enlightenment. Others manifested as warrior entities promising strength and glory. Still others took shapes that defied description, geometries that hurt to perceive and presences that conveyed meaning through pure emotion rather than any physical form. The word-bearer's initial response was to resist these manifestations, to drive them back through force of will and bolter fire. But Lorgar commanded his sons to hold their weapons and observe. He approached the demons not as enemies, but as sources of information, beings that might provide the answers he sought. The Primarch's psychic presence was strong enough that the demons recognized him as something more than a simple mortal, and they responded to his inquiries with a mixture of mockery and genuine revelation. Through these encounters, Lorgar began to understand the true nature of the powers that dwelt in the warp. They were not gods in the sense he had worshipped the Emperor, not conscious creators who had deliberately brought the universe into being. Instead, they were emergent phenomena, entities that had coalesced from the collective psychic emanations of sentient beings over millions of years. They had consciousness and will, but these qualities were fundamentally different from mortal consciousness. The warp powers thought in terms of concepts and emotions rather than linear logic, and their goals reflected the aspects of reality they embodied rather than any conventional morality. The most profound revelation came when Lorgar finally perceived the Emperor as the warp powers saw him. The master of mankind appeared in the Imperium not as the golden figure of Lorgar's visions, but as a blazing presence of such intensity that it burned away the warp's natural currents wherever it touched. The Emperor was anathema to the warp powers, not because he was good and they were evil, but because his very existence disrupted the relationship between material and immaterial reality that they depended upon. The imperial truth, the philosophy that denied the existence of gods and rejected all forms of worship, was designed to starve the warp powers by cutting off the flow of belief and emotion that sustained them. This understanding transformed Lorgar's perspective on everything that had happened. The Emperor had not rejected his worship out of humility or a desire for humanity to stand on its own. He had done so because worship itself fed the warp powers, strengthening them and making them more capable of influencing the material realm. The destruction of Monarchia was not simply a rebuke to Lorgar personally, but an attempt to prevent the spread of religious devotion that would empower the very entities the Emperor sought to suppress or destroy. The master of mankind's grand design was not enlightenment, but domination, the elimination of all rivals to his singular rule over humanity. The bitterness that filled Lorgar as he processed these revelations was absolute and consuming. He had devoted his entire existence to worshipping the Emperor, had shaped his legion and his conquests around spreading that worship, had genuinely believed that he was serving his father's will more faithfully than any of his brothers. Now he understood that every prayer, every temple, every act of devotion had been unwanted not because they were false, but because they threatened the Emperor's monopoly on power. The humiliation at Monarchia took on new dimensions. It was not correction of a wayward son, but the silencing of a threat to the Emperor's plans. Yet alongside the bitterness came a strange form of liberation. If the Emperor was not divine, if he was simply another being seeking power through manipulation and control, then Lorgar's need for faith could be directed elsewhere. The warp powers were real in ways the Emperor had denied. They were conscious entities of immense capability who did not reject worship but actively sought it. They offered knowledge, strength, and purpose to those who understood their nature and accepted the relationship they proposed. Where the Emperor demanded service without reciprocation, the warp powers offered a true exchange: devotion in return for power, worship in return for transformation. The word-bearers who accompanied Lorgar on this pilgrimage underwent their own transformations. Exposure to the warp's direct influence changed them in ways both subtle and profound. Their physical forms remained largely unchanged, but their perceptions expanded to encompass realities they had never imagined. They began to see the warp not as a realm of madness and corruption, but as a source of truth that the Emperor had hidden from humanity. The demons they encountered became teachers rather than enemies, guides who revealed the possibilities that awaited those willing to embrace the full spectrum of existence rather than limiting themselves to the material realm alone. Argel Tal and his warriors, who would later become known as the Gal Vorbak, experienced the most dramatic changes. They volunteered to undergo a ritual that Lorgar had learned from the demonic entities, a process that would bind warp beings directly to their souls. This was possession, but not the mindless corruption that Imperial doctrine warned against. Instead, it was a deliberate melding of mortal and demon, creating hybrid beings that retain their identity and will while gaining access to the warp's power. The process was agonizing and dangerous, with several warriors dying or going irreversibly mad during the transformation. Those who survived emerged as something new: space marines whose bodies could shift between material and immaterial forms, warriors who could channel demonic strength while maintaining their loyalty to Lorgar and the word-bearers. The pilgrimage lasted for what the word-bearers estimated was 6 months, though time within the Eye of Terror did not correspond reliably to time in normal space. When Lorgar finally commanded the fleet to depart, returning to the material universe, he did so as a fundamentally changed being. The faith that had defined him since childhood remained as strong as ever, but its object had shifted completely. Where once he had worshipped the Emperor as the one true God, he now understood that there were multiple powers deserving of devotion, entities that did not reject worship, but welcomed it as part of the natural relationship between mortals and the divine. The word-bearers emerged from the Eye of Terror with new purpose and new understanding. They had entered seeking truth about the universe and their place in it. They had found that truth, though it was darker and more complex than anything they had imagined. The Emperor was not a god, but a tyrant seeking to deny humanity access to its full potential. The warp powers were not demons, but gods in the truest sense, beings worthy of worship who offered genuine rewards to their followers. And Lorgar himself was not a failed son, but a prophet who had been chosen to reveal these truths to humanity, to tear down the Emperor's lies and replace them with genuine faith. The word-bearers who returned from the Eye of Terror were not the same legion that had entered. The changes ran deeper than simple disillusionment with the Emperor or rejection of the Imperial truth. Lorgar and his chosen warriors had gazed into the fundamental nature of reality and emerged with knowledge that transformed their understanding of existence itself. Where other legions saw the Great Crusade as a military endeavor to unite humanity under the Emperor's rule, the word-bearers now understood it as a cosmic conflict between different visions of what humanity could become. The Emperor sought to starve the warp powers through enforced atheism and rigid control over human belief. Lorgar now intended to do the opposite, to spread worship of the true gods and prepare humanity for its transformation through chaos. The transition from loyal servants of the Emperor to architects of galactic rebellion required careful planning and absolute secrecy. Lorgar could not simply announce his new faith to the Imperium. Such an open declaration would result in immediate censure and likely the destruction of the entire Word-Bearers Legion. Instead, he adopted a strategy of patient subversion, using the decades of trust and authority the Legion had built to slowly corrupt the Imperium from within. The Word-Bearers would appear to comply with the Emperor's demands for increased conquest rates, while simultaneously laying the groundwork for the greatest betrayal in human history. The first challenge was ensuring the loyalty and conversion of the entire Word-Bearers Legion. The warriors who had accompanied Lorgar into the Eye understood the truth he had discovered, but tens of thousands of other Word-Bearers remained scattered across the galaxy, still believing in the Imperial cause despite their humiliation at Monarchia. Lorgar could not risk dissent within his own ranks. He initiated a systematic program of education and conversion, bringing company commanders and veteran sergeants to the flagship for extended consultations where they were exposed to the knowledge gained from the pilgrimage. Those who embraced the truth were promoted and given positions of greater authority. Those who resisted or expressed doubt simply disappeared, their fates never officially recorded, but understood by those who remained. Erebus proved invaluable during this period of internal transformation. As first chaplain, he had authority over the Legion's spiritual instruction and used this position to reshape the word-bearer's belief structure. The chaplains under his command began delivering new sermons that subtly introduced concepts from the warp. They spoke of powers beyond the material realm, of the limitations of the imperial truth, of the emperor's hypocrisy in denying divinity while demanding absolute obedience. These ideas were presented carefully, wrapped in language that could be interpreted as orthodox if questioned, but which conveyed their true meaning to those ready to hear it. The warrior lodge system that had existed in the word-bearers since their earliest days became vehicles for more explicit instruction, with trusted brothers sharing forbidden knowledge in gatherings that occurred outside the normal command structure. The warrior lodges themselves deserved particular attention as instruments of corruption. These informal organizations had existed in various forms across several legions, serving as places where Astartes could gather outside the strict hierarchy of military rank. In the lodges, a captain and a line trooper could speak as equals, sharing concerns and building bonds of brotherhood that transcended formal authority. The word-bearers had maintained lodges since the Legion's founding, viewing them as useful tools for maintaining morale and unit cohesion. Now Lorgar recognized their potential for spreading chaos worship while maintaining plausible deniability. The lodges operated in secrecy by their very nature, with membership known only to other lodge brothers and meetings held in private spaces away from official observation. This structure was perfect for introducing warriors to chaos concepts gradually, allowing them to explore forbidden knowledge without immediately committing themselves to heresy. A word-bearer might attend a lodge meeting, expecting normal brotherhood and discussion of Legion matters, only to hear another brother speak of strange experiences during warp travel or philosophical questions about the nature of divinity. These conversations planted seeds that could grow into full acceptance of chaos over time, and the lodge structure ensured that any warrior who rejected these ideas would be quietly excluded from future meetings rather than becoming a threat to the broader conspiracy. Erebus took the lodge system that existed within the word-bearers and refined it into a tool for spreading corruption beyond the 17th Legion. He recognized that other legions had their own lodge traditions or could be encouraged to adopt them, and that these organizations could serve as vectors for introducing chaos worship throughout the Astartes forces. The key was patience and careful selection of targets. Not every legion would be receptive to corruption, and attempting to subvert the wrong warriors could expose the entire conspiracy before it bore fruit. The corruption of Horus Lupercal and the 16th Legion represented the most crucial element of Lorgar's plan. Horus was the War Master, appointed by the Emperor himself to command the Great Crusade, while the Master of Mankind returned to Terra to work on secret projects within the Imperial Palace. No rebellion against the Emperor could succeed without Horus, both because of the military forces under his direct command and because of his influence over his brother Primarchs. Many of the legions would follow Horus purely out of personal loyalty, regardless of the cause he championed. If Lorgar could turn the War Master to chaos, half the Imperium would follow. The word-bearers had been cultivating relationships with the Luna Wolves, later renamed the Sons of Horus, for decades. Chaplains from the 17th Legion had served as advisors and liaison officers with the 16th, ostensibly to help them develop their own chaplain corps and spiritual instruction programs. These word-bearers had introduced the lodge system to the Sons of Horus, presenting it as a useful tool for maintaining morale and brotherhood. The lodges spread through the 16th Legion's companies, becoming popular gathering places where warriors could speak freely without the constraints of rank. What the Sons of Horus did not realize was that their lodge traditions had been deliberately designed by word-bearers' chaplains to make them receptive to later corruption. Erebus personally cultivated relationships with key officers in the Sons of Horus, including the Lodge Masters who controlled access to these organizations. He presented himself as a brother and ally, someone who understood the challenges of serving in the Astartes and the questions that naturally arose when warriors spent too much time contemplating the nature of the Great Crusade. These relationships took years to develop, with Erebus making regular visits to the 16th Legion's fleet and participating in their campaigns. He earned their trust through shared combat and careful manipulation, positioning himself as a valued advisor whose counsel was sought on matters both military and philosophical. The opportunity to corrupt Horus himself came on the world of Davin, a planet the War Master had brought into Imperial compliance years earlier. Davin's population had reverted to worship of chaos powers, though they did not understand the entities they served in those terms. The world's ruling warrior lodges, which bore suspicious similarity to the lodge structures Erebus had introduced to the Sons of Horus, practiced rituals that channeled warp energy and maintained shrines to the chaos gods. When the Sons of Horus returned to Davin to reinforce compliance, they found a world that had rejected the imperial truth and embraced something far darker. The campaign on Davin proceeded normally until Horus was wounded by a weapon known as the anatheme, a blade that had been stolen from the Sons of Horus' own fortress monastery and corrupted through chaos rituals. The weapon's origins were no accident. Erebus had arranged for the blade to fall into the hands of Davin's corrupt priesthood, knowing that it carried a portion of Horus's own genetic material and could therefore bypass his normally impregnable defenses. When the War Master was struck by the anatheme, the wound it inflicted was not simply physical but spiritual, a corruption that spread through his body and soul simultaneously. Horus collapsed into a coma from which normal medical treatment could not rouse him. The apothecaries of the Sons of Horus tried every technique in their considerable arsenal, but the War Master's condition only deteriorated. It was Erebus who suggested an alternative treatment, pointing out that Davin's warrior lodges maintained healing traditions that predated imperial compliance. These local priests claimed they could treat spiritual afflictions that conventional medicine could not address. The suggestion was carefully calculated. Erebus knew that the Sons of Horus were desperate to save their Primarch and would consider options they would normally reject. He also knew that the healing ritual the Davinite priests would perform was actually a chaos ceremony designed to expose Horus to the direct influence of the warp powers. The ritual took place in a temple dedicated to the chaos gods, though its true nature was disguised through local religious terminology that the Sons of Horus did not fully understand. Horus was placed within a circle of power while the Davinite priests conducted their ceremony, chanting invocations that drew warp energy into the material realm. The War Master's consciousness was pulled from his body and cast into the Imperium, where he experienced visions carefully crafted by the Chaos Gods to exploit his pride, his ambition, and his resentment toward the Emperor. In these visions, Horus saw a future where the Emperor had abandoned the Great Crusade and elevated himself to godhood, ruling over a theocratic Imperium, while the Primarchs and their legions were cast aside as obsolete tools. He saw his brothers reduced to objects of worship rather than respected as the warriors and leaders they were. He saw himself forgotten, his accomplishments attributed to the Emperor's divinity rather than his own skill and sacrifice. The visions were lies, distortions of possible futures twisted to serve the Chaos God's purposes, but they contained enough truth to be believable. The Emperor had indeed returned to Terra and left Horus to command the crusade. The Master of Mankind was working on secret projects he had not fully explained to his sons, and despite his rejection of worship, the Emperor had not prevented the development of religious movements that venerated him across the Imperium. Erebus was present when Horus emerged from the ritual, and he carefully reinforced the conclusions the War Master had drawn from his visions. The first chaplain presented himself as someone who had also discovered uncomfortable truths about the Emperor's intentions, who had come to understand that the Master of Mankind viewed the Primarchs and their legions as tools to be discarded once they had served their purpose. He spoke of the Emperor's hypocrisy, demanding loyalty while offering none in return, crushing any expression of faith while building his own cult of personality. and he revealed the existence of the warp powers, presenting them not as demons, but as alternatives to the Emperor's tyranny, entities that offered genuine rewards to those who served them. Horus's conversion was not immediate or simple. The War Master was too intelligent and too experienced to accept Erebus's claims without question. But the seeds of doubt had been planted, and they grew as Horus contemplated his relationship with the Emperor and the future of the Imperium. The wound from the anathema had created a spiritual vulnerability that made him receptive to chaos influence in ways he would not have been otherwise. Over the following months, Erebus and other word-bearers chaplains carefully cultivated that vulnerability, providing Horus with forbidden knowledge and introducing him to the powers that dwelt in the warp. The corruption of the Sons of Horus proceeded in parallel with their Primarch's fall. The warrior lodges that Erebus had helped establish became centers of chaos worship, with lodge masters leading their brothers in rituals that drew on warp energy. These ceremonies were presented as brotherhood bonding exercises or spiritual development practices, their true nature disguised through careful terminology and gradual escalation. A warrior might participate in what seemed like a harmless meditation session, only to find himself exposed to warp entities that began whispering promises of power and transformation. The process was designed to make each step seem reasonable, to prevent warriors from recognizing how far they had fallen until it was too late to turn back. The World Eater's Legion proved receptive to corruption for different reasons than the Sons of Horus. Angron, the 12th Legion's Primarch, had been brutalized by his experiences on his homeworld of New Syria, where he had been forced to fight as a gladiator with neural implants called the Butcher's Nails embedded in his brain. These devices stimulated aggression and suppressed other emotions, turning Angron into a being of constant rage and pain. The Emperor had taken Angron from New Syria at the moment of his greatest need, teleporting him away while his fellow gladiator rebels were slaughtered by their oppressors. This abandonment had created a wound in Angron's psyche that never healed, a resentment toward the Emperor that made him vulnerable to manipulation. The World Eaters had adopted versions of the Butcher's Nails themselves, voluntarily undergoing the implantation process to better understand their Primarch and to enhance their combat effectiveness. The nails made them savage fighters, but also unstable and difficult to control, prone to fits of mindless violence that made them unsuitable for many types of military operations. Word-bearers chaplains who served alongside the World Eaters recognized that the Legion's rage could be channeled toward chaos purposes. They introduced the World Eaters to the concept of Khorne, the blood god who embodied warfare, violence, and the glory of combat. Khorne did not demand complex rituals or theological understanding. He simply required blood and skulls, offerings that the World Eaters were already providing through their brutal campaigns. The corruption of the World Eaters was less about converting them to new beliefs and more about redirecting their existing tendencies toward chaos purposes. Word-bearers chaplains spoke to World Eaters officers about the nobility of violence, about how combat was the purest form of existence, and how the Emperor's attempts to impose order and civilization were insults to warriors of their caliber. They suggested that Angron's rage was not a flaw but a blessing, that the Butcher's Nails connected him to fundamental truths about existence that others were too weak to embrace. These ideas resonated with World Eaters who had struggled to find meaning in their existence beyond the next battle, who had sensed that something was wrong with the Imperium's direction but could not articulate their concerns. The Emperor's children presented a different challenge for corruption. The Third Legion prided itself on perfection in all endeavors, from martial skill to artistic expression. Their Primarch, Fulgrim, was a being of exquisite refinement who demanded excellence from his sons in every aspect of their existence. The word-bearers recognized that this pursuit of perfection created its own vulnerabilities. The constant striving for improvement, the never-satisfied desire to exceed previous accomplishments, could be twisted into service of Slaanesh, the chaos god who embodied excess, sensation, and the pursuit of experience beyond normal limits. Word-bearers chaplains introduced Emperor's children officers to philosophical concepts about the nature of perfection and the limitations imposed by the Emperor's vision for humanity. They suggested that true perfection required exploring all aspects of existence, including those the emperor had declared forbidden. The imperial truth's rejection of emotion and spirituality was actually a limitation that prevented the emperor's children from achieving their full potential. By embracing sensation and experience without restriction, by pushing beyond the boundaries of conventional morality and physical limitation, the Third Legion could achieve the perfection they sought. The corruption of the Death Guard followed yet another pattern. Mortarion, the 14th Legion's Primarch, harbored deep resentment toward the Emperor based on events during his discovery on the world of Barbarus. The Emperor had stolen Mortarion's final victory against his adoptive father, a warlord who had ruled Barbarus through sorcery and fear. This intervention had robbed Mortarion of the closure he needed, and had forced him into service to a being whose methods he fundamentally distrusted. The Death Guard Primarch despised psychers and sorcery, viewing them as tools of tyrants and oppressors. This prejudice made him an unlikely target for chaos corruption, but it also created opportunities for manipulation. Word-bearers working to corrupt the Death Guard focused on Mortarion's pride and his resentment toward the Emperor. They presented chaos not as sorcery, but as natural power, as the true state of the universe that the Emperor was trying to suppress through artificial constraints. They spoke of Nurgle, the plague god, not as a demon, but as an embodiment of life's fundamental processes, of decay and rebirth, of endurance through suffering. These concepts resonated with the Death Guard's identity as warriors who specialized in grinding attrition warfare, who took pride in their ability to endure conditions that would break other legions. The Council of Nicaea represented a crucial moment in the timeline leading to the heresy, though Lorgar's direct involvement in the event was limited. The council was convened by the Emperor to address the question of whether the legions should continue to employ librarians, Astartes with psychic abilities, who served as battlefield assets and sources of intelligence. Mortarion and several other Primarchs argued that librarians represented dangerous sources of warp contamination, that their powers came from the same realm as sorcery and demonology, and therefore should be forbidden. Magnus, the Red of the Thousand Suns Legion, defended the librarians, arguing that psychic power, properly understood and controlled, was a valuable tool that the Imperium could not afford to abandon. The Emperor sided with the anti-librarian faction, decreeing that all legions would disband their librarian departments, and that Astartes with psychic abilities would either suppress their powers or face censure. This decision was catastrophic for the Thousand Suns, whose entire legion culture was built around the study and application of psychic abilities. Magnus was humiliated before his brothers, his life's work dismissed as dangerous, and his legion's practices condemned as reckless. The decree also affected other legions that had maintained significant librarian departments, forcing them to abandon assets they had spent decades developing. Lorgar recognized the Council of Nicaea's outcome as beneficial to his plans, even though he had not orchestrated it. The censure of Magnus and the Thousand Suns created another Primarch with grievances against the Emperor, another potential ally in the coming rebellion. The disbanding of librarian departments removed one of the Imperium's most effective tools for detecting warp corruption, as librarians were trained to sense demonic influence and psychic manipulation. Without these specialists, the Word-Bearers' corruption efforts would face less resistance and detection. The Council also demonstrated the Emperor's willingness to humiliate and constrain his sons when their methods conflicted with his vision, reinforcing the narrative that Lorgar had been spreading about the Emperor's tyranny. The systematic corruption of the legions proceeded over several decades, with word-bearers, chaplains, and liaison officers working patiently to spread chaos worship through lodge systems and personal relationships. Not every legion proved receptive to their efforts. The Ultramarines under Guilliman remained firmly loyal, their Primarch's rational approach to warfare and governance making them resistant to spiritual manipulation. The Imperial Fists under Rogel Dorn similarly rejected any suggestion of disloyalty, their absolute dedication to duty preventing word-bearers from gaining significant influence. The Blood Angels, the Dark Angels, and several other legions maintained their loyalty despite word-bearers' attempts to sway them. but the legions that did fall to chaos represented a significant portion of the Astartes forces, and more importantly, they included the War Master himself. With Horus corrupted and committed to rebellion, Lorgar had achieved the crucial prerequisite for the heresy to succeed. The Word-Bearers had positioned themselves as the hidden architects of the galaxy's greatest betrayal, working behind the scenes while others would bear the public face of rebellion. When the heresy finally began in open warfare, the Imperium would believe it was Horus's ambition that had driven the conflict. Few would recognize that Lorgar and the Word-Bearers had spent decades laying the groundwork, that the 17th Legion had corrupted their brothers through patient manipulation, and the systematic spread of chaos worship through the Legion's Astartes. The alliance between Lorgar and Angron emerged from necessity as much as genuine brotherhood, though the relationship between the two Primarchs would prove more complex than simple strategic convenience. When Horus began organizing the rebellion that would tear the Imperium apart, he assigned specific roles to each of the legions that had turned against the Emperor. The Word-Bearers and World Eaters received orders to prosecute a joint campaign through the Ultramar sector, the 500 worlds that Roboute Guilliman had transformed into a model of imperial governance and military efficiency. The strategic objective was straightforward: keep Guilliman and his 13th Legion occupied far from Terra, while Horus led the main traitor force toward the throne world itself. Guilliman commanded the largest legion in terms of raw numbers, with estimates placing the Ultramarines at over 250,000 Astartes before the heresy began. More concerning than their size was their reputation for rapid response and strategic flexibility. If Guilliman learned of Horus's betrayal and managed to bring his full strength to bear on Terra's defense, the rebellion might fail before it truly began. The Shadow Crusade, as the joint Word-Bearers and World Eaters campaign would become known, was designed to prevent this scenario. By attacking Ultramar directly, by threatening the worlds Guilliman had spent decades perfecting, Lorgar and Angron would force the Lord of Macragge to commit his forces to defending his realm rather than reinforcing the Emperor. The planning for the campaign fell primarily to Lorgar and his senior officers, as Angron showed little interest in strategic considerations beyond identifying the next target to assault. The Red Angel's condition had deteriorated significantly since his discovery on Nuceria decades earlier. The butcher's nails implanted in his brain caused him constant agony that could only be temporarily relieved through violence. He had long since lost the ability to experience emotions beyond rage and the brief satisfaction that came from killing. Attempting to discuss long-term strategy with Angron was an exercise in futility. He would listen with barely contained impatience before demanding to know when the killing would begin. Cor Pharon received command of the initial strike against Calth, one of Ultramar's most significant worlds, and a major mustering point for Ultramarines' forces. The Master of the Faith had spent the years since the pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror consolidating his position within the Word-Bearers' hierarchy and deepening his understanding of chaos sorcery. He was not a Primarch and lacked the raw power that Lorgar or Angron could bring to bear, but his cunning and his willingness to employ any method to achieve victory made him dangerous in ways that transcended simple combat effectiveness. The selection of Cor Pharon for the Calth operation reflected the importance Lorgar placed on ensuring the battle's success and the complete devastation of Ultramarines' forces stationed there. The approach to Calth was conducted under false pretenses that exploited the trust between legions that had not yet been completely shattered by the heresy's outbreak. The Word-Bearers' fleet arrived in the Viridia system, claiming to be responding to War Master Horus's orders for a general muster of loyalist forces. They transmitted proper identification codes and maintained standard Imperial protocols, giving the Ultramarines no reason to suspect treachery. The 13th Legion had received word that some of their brother legions had turned traitor, but the information was incomplete and confused. They did not yet understand the full scope of the rebellion or which forces remained loyal to the Emperor. Guilliman himself was not present on Calth when the Word-Bearers arrived, having departed the system days earlier to attend to other matters within Ultramar. This absence was not accidental. Lorgar had carefully timed the attack to coincide with periods when the Lord of Macragge would be elsewhere, ensuring that the Ultramarines on Calth would lack their Primarch's leadership during the critical opening phases of the battle. The Ultramarines' forces on the planet numbered in the tens of thousands, a significant portion of the Legion's strength, but without Guilliman to coordinate their response, they would be vulnerable to the kind of devastating surprise attack that Corferon planned to deliver. The Word-Bearers' fleet positioned itself in orbit around Calth, their vessels mingling with Ultramarines' ships in a formation that appeared cooperative rather than hostile. Corferon maintained communications with the Ultramarines' ground commanders, discussing logistics and coordination for the supposed muster that Horus had ordered. The Ultramarines, despite their legendary discipline and attention to detail, did not detect the threat until it was too late. They had fought alongside the Word-Bearers during the Great Crusade, had shared battlefields and victories with the 17th Legion. The idea that their cousins would turn on them without warning was outside their frame of reference, a betrayal so profound that it seemed impossible until the moment it occurred. The attack began with orbital bombardment of catastrophic intensity. Word-Bearers' vessels that had been positioned as friendly allies suddenly opened fire on Ultramarines' ships and ground installations. Lance strikes and macro cannon salvos tore through unprepared defenses, destroying void shields that had not been raised to combat strength and targeting weapons batteries that had not been manned for immediate action. The Ultramarines' fleet, caught completely by surprise, suffered devastating losses in the opening minutes of the engagement. Ships that might have escaped or mounted effective resistance were crippled or destroyed before their crews fully understood what was happening. The ground assault followed immediately after the orbital bombardment began. Word-Bearers dropped pods and Thunderhawk gunships descended on Calth's surface, targeting Ultramarines' positions with precision strikes designed to maximize chaos and prevent organized resistance. The 17th Legion's warriors emerged from their transports with bolters firing, cutting down Ultramarines who were still trying to comprehend why their supposed allies had turned on them. The initial shock of the betrayal gave the Word-Bearers a crucial advantage, allowing them to seize key positions and establish fortified zones before the Ultramarines could mount coordinated counterattacks. Corferon had prepared for this moment with meticulous attention to detail that reflected his decades of experience in manipulation and warfare. He had studied Calth's defenses, identified weak points in the Ultramarines' deployment, and positioned Word-Bearers' forces to exploit those vulnerabilities with maximum efficiency. The attack was not simply a military operation, but a ritual of destruction, with specific targets selected for both their strategic value and their symbolic significance. Corferon intended to break the Ultramarines not just physically, but spiritually, to demonstrate that their vaunted discipline and organization meant nothing against warriors who had embraced chaos. The most devastating aspect of the Calth attack was not the immediate military damage, but the warp sorcery that Corferon unleashed during the battle. The Master of the Faith had brought with him a device of ancient origin, a relic that the Word-Bearers had discovered during their campaigns and corrupted through chaos rituals. This artifact, when activated at the proper moment with the correct incantations, would tear open the barrier between material and immaterial reality on a scale never before attempted. Corferon waited until the battle had reached its peak intensity, until Ultramarines and Word-Bearers were fully engaged across Calth's surface and in orbit above it, before activating the device. The result was the creation of what would become known as the Ruin Storm, a massive warp anomaly that engulfed the entire Ultramar sector and surrounding regions of space. The storm was not a natural phenomenon, but a deliberately crafted barrier of warp energy that made travel through the affected regions nearly impossible. Ships that attempted to enter the storm encountered conditions that drove their crews mad or tore the vessels apart through impossible gravitational stresses. Astropathic communication through the storm was unreliable at best, with messages becoming garbled or failing to transmit entirely. The Ruin Storm effectively isolated Ultramar from the rest of the Imperium, preventing Guilliman from receiving accurate information about the broader heresy and making it impossible for him to bring his legion's strength to bear on Terra's defense. The sorcery required to create the Ruin Storm was immense, drawing on power that Corferon had accumulated through years of chaos worship and ritual sacrifice. The activation of the device killed thousands of word-bearers who had been positioned around it as part of the ritual, their life energies consumed to fuel the warp breach. Corferon himself was nearly destroyed by the backlash of psychic energy, suffering injuries that would take months to heal, even with the enhanced physiology granted by his partial Astartes augmentation. But the sacrifice achieved its purpose. The ruin storm would persist for years, reshaping the strategic situation of the entire heresy and ensuring that Guilliman could not interfere with Horus's advance on Terra. The Ultramarines on Calth fought with characteristic determination despite the catastrophic situation. They rallied under their remaining officers, establishing defensive positions and mounting counterattacks wherever possible. The battle devolved into brutal close quarters, fighting as word-bearers and Ultramarines clashed in the ruins of what had been one of Ultramar's most prosperous worlds. The Ultramarines were outnumbered and had lost the advantage of surprise, but they were fighting for their home territory and refused to yield. The combat continued for weeks, with neither side able to achieve complete victory. The word-bearers controlled much of Calth's surface, but Ultramarines' resistance prevented them from fully securing the planet. Lorgar himself was not present at Calth during the initial attack or the subsequent grinding battle. The Urizen had other priorities, chief among them his relationship with his brother Angron and the plans he had developed for the Red Angel's future. Lorgar had spent considerable time studying Angron since the alliance between their legions had been formalized, observing the 12th Legion's Primarch with a mixture of pity and calculation. Angron was dying, his body slowly being destroyed by the butcher's nails that had been embedded in his brain for decades. The neural implants were never designed for long-term use, and they were gradually killing their host through accumulated damage to his brain tissue and nervous system. The relationship between Lorgar and Angron was complicated by their fundamentally different natures. Lorgar was a being of faith and contemplation, someone who sought meaning and purpose in the universe, and who needed to believe in something greater than himself. Angron had been stripped of the ability to contemplate anything beyond his next kill, reduced to a creature of pure rage by the combination of his traumatic experiences on Nuceria and the butcher's nails that dominated his thoughts. Yet Lorgar felt genuine affection for his broken brother, seeing in Angron a victim of the Emperor's callousness and a soul that deserved salvation, even if it could not be saved in conventional terms. Lorgar's concept of salvation for Angron was not what most would consider mercy. The Urizen had learned during his pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror that death was not the end for those who had given themselves to chaos. The warp powers could grant a form of immortality to their most devoted servants, transforming them into demon princes who existed partially in the material realm and partially in the immaterium. This apotheosis was not without cost. A demon prince was no longer truly mortal, no longer fully themselves in the way they had been before transformation. But for Angron, who was already barely mortal and barely himself, the transformation might offer the only escape from the constant agony of the butcher's nails. The decision to pursue Angron's transformation into a demon prince was made by Lorgar without consulting his brother. The Red Angel would not have understood the concept or cared about the implications. He wanted only to kill, to experience the brief moments of relief that violence provided before the pain returned. Lorgar recognized that any attempt to explain what he intended would be futile. Instead, he began making preparations for the ritual that would damn Angron's soul and transform him into something that transcended mortality. The location chosen for the ritual was Nuceria, Angron's homeworld and the source of his greatest trauma. The Red Angel had never returned to Nuceria after the Emperor took him from the planet decades earlier, leaving his fellow gladiator rebels to die at the hands of the planetary nobility. The wound of that abandonment had never healed, and Angron's rage toward the Emperor was intimately connected to his memories of Nuceria and the brothers and sisters he had lost there. Lorgar understood that the ritual to transform Angron would require immense emotional and psychic energy, and that Nuceria provided the perfect environment to generate that energy. The World Eaters and Word-Bearers fleets arrived at Nuceria as part of the Shadow Crusade's progression through the Ultramar sector. The planet was not a significant military target, but Angron insisted on attacking it with an intensity that surprised even his own legion. The Red Angel led the assault personally, descending to the surface with thousands of World Eaters at his back. The nobility who had once ruled Nuceria and forced Angron to fight in their arenas were hunted down and slaughtered with methodical brutality. Cities were burned, monuments toppled, and the entire planetary infrastructure systematically destroyed. Lorgar accompanied Angron during the assault on Nuceria, observing his brother's rage and waiting for the proper moment to begin the ritual. The Urizen had brought with him a cadre of word-bearers sorcerers who had spent years studying the process of demonic apotheosis, learning the incantations, and gathering the materials necessary to tear open the barrier between material and immaterial reality. These sorcerers positioned themselves at key locations across Nuceria's surface, creating a geometric pattern that would focus warp energy toward a central point where Angron would undergo his transformation. The ritual began as Angron stood among the ruins of the arena where he had once fought as a slave. Lorgar had orchestrated events to bring his brother to this specific location, knowing that the emotional resonance of the site would amplify the warp energies being channeled. The word-bearers sorcerers began their chanting, their voices speaking words in languages that predated human civilization, calling on the power of Khorne to manifest in the material realm. The air around Angron began to shimmer and distort as reality itself weakened under the assault of immaterial forces. Angron initially did not understand what was happening to him. The Red Angel felt the familiar pain of the butcher's nails, but now there was something else, a sensation of being pulled apart and reconstructed simultaneously. His body began to change, growing larger and more inhuman with each passing moment. His skin darkened and hardened into something resembling armor, while his muscles expanded beyond even Primarch proportions. Wings of brass and leather erupted from his back, and his face elongated into something bestial and terrible. The transformation was agonizing beyond anything even Angron had experienced, but it was also liberating. For the first time since the butcher's nails had been implanted in his brain, the constant pain began to recede, replaced by a different kind of sensation that was both alien and intoxicating. The demon prince that emerged from the ritual was recognizably Angron, but also fundamentally changed. He stood nearly twice the height he had before, his form radiating warp energy that caused reality to distort in his presence. The butcher's nails were still embedded in his skull, but they no longer dominated his existence. Instead, they had become integrated into his demonic nature, channeling his rage in ways that enhanced rather than destroyed him. Angron had become an avatar of Khorne, a being of pure violence that existed to kill and destroy in the blood god's name. The cost of Angron's transformation extended beyond the Red Angel himself. The ritual had required immense sacrifice, with thousands of World Eaters dying to provide the psychic energy necessary to tear open the barrier between realms. These warriors had given their lives willingly, viewing their deaths as offerings to the same powers that had elevated their Primarch. The word-bearers sorcerers who conducted the ritual were similarly affected, with several dying from the strain of channeling such vast amounts of warp energy, and others suffering permanent damage to their minds and bodies. Nuceria itself was destroyed as a consequence of the ritual's completion. The warp energies that had been channeled through the planet's surface left it a dead world, its atmosphere poisoned and its crust cracked by impossible stresses. The population that had survived the initial World Eater's assault died in the aftermath of the ritual, their souls consumed by the warp breach that Lorgar had created. The planet that had once been Angron's prison became his funeral pyre, a monument to his transformation from Primarch to Demon Prince. The transformation of Angron demonstrated Lorgar's mastery of chaos sorcery and his willingness to damn his brothers for what he considered the greater truth. The Urizen had taken one of the Emperor's sons and transformed him into something the master of mankind would consider an abomination, a being that could never be redeemed or returned to the Imperial fold. This was not an act of malice, but of faith. Lorgar genuinely believed he had saved Angron, that he had rescued his brother from a slow death and granted him a form of immortality that would allow him to continue fighting forever. The newly ascended demon prince Angron proved to be an even more devastating force on the battlefield than he had been as a mortal Primarch. His demonic nature granted him abilities that transcended physical law, allowing him to manifest and dismiss himself from reality at will, and to channel Khorne's power in ways that turned entire battlefields into charnel houses. The World Eaters who witnessed their Primarch's transformation were inspired to even greater acts of violence, viewing Angron's ascension as proof that their devotion to the Blood God would be rewarded. The Shadow Crusade continued with renewed intensity following the events on Nuceria. Lorgar and the Demon Prince Angron led their combined forces deeper into Ultramar, attacking world after world with systematic brutality. The campaign was not designed to hold territory, but to destroy it, to inflict maximum damage on Guilliman's realm, and prevent the Ultramarines from contributing to Terra's defense. Cities were reduced to rubble, populations slaughtered or enslaved, and the careful infrastructure that Guilliman had built over decades was torn apart. The Word-Bearers and World Eaters left nothing but devastation in their wake, transforming the 500 worlds into a war zone that would take centuries to rebuild. The approach to Terra represented the culmination of years of planning, betrayal, and warfare that had torn the Imperium apart. The solar system, humanity's ancestral home and the seat of the Emperor's power, had been fortified over centuries to withstand any conceivable attack. Yet the traitor forces that gathered at the system's edge in the early 31st millennium were unlike any threat the Imperium had prepared to face. These were not Xeno's invaders or human rebels, but the Emperor's own sons and their legions, warriors who knew every detail of Terra's defenses because they had helped design them. The Word-Bearers participated in the Solar War with significant force, though their role differed from the more straightforward military contributions of legions like the Sons of Horus or the Iron Warriors. Lorgar commanded elements of his legion that had been held in reserve during the Shadow Crusade, warriors who had not spent years grinding through Ultramar, but had instead been preparing for the assault on the throne world itself. The 17th Legion's fleet approached the solar system as part of the larger traitor armada, their vessels bearing the marks of chaos corruption that had become increasingly visible as the heresy progressed. Where once the Word-Bearers had painted their armor in proud crimson and gold, many now bore the 8-pointed star of chaos, undivided or symbols specific to individual warp powers they had sworn themselves to. The coordination between traitor legions during the Solar War required constant communication and negotiation, as the alliance Horus had forged remained fragile despite their shared goal of overthrowing the Emperor. Lorgar's role in these discussions was significant but often overlooked by historians who focused on more obvious military commanders. The Urizen served as a bridge between different factions within the traitor forces, using his diplomatic skills and his understanding of his brother's motivations to maintain cohesion when disagreements threatened to fracture the alliance. He met with Perturabo of the Iron Warriors to discuss siege tactics, with Mortarion of the Death Guard to coordinate biological warfare strategies, and with the Demon Prince Angron to ensure the World Eater's fury would be directed at Imperial defenders rather than their supposed allies. The Word-Bearers brought to the Solar War capabilities that other legions lacked or refused to employ. Their decades of studying chaos sorcery had produced cadres of warrior sorcerers who could manipulate warp energy with precision that even the Thousand Suns might grudgingly acknowledge. These sorcerers worked to weaken the psychic defenses that protected key Imperial positions, creating breaches in the wards that the Emperor and his most powerful psychers had established around Terra and the other fortified worlds of the solar system. The process was methodical and required constant maintenance, as Imperial psychers worked to repair the damage and reinforce their protections. The struggle between Word-Bearers sorcerers and Imperial psychic defenders occurred on a level beyond normal human perception, a war of willpower and warp manipulation that complemented the physical battles raging across the system. The relationship between Lorgar and Corvus Corax had been poisoned long before the heresy began, though the full depth of their mutual hatred would only become apparent during the war itself. The Raven Guard Primarch represented everything Lorgar was not, a warrior who valued action over words, pragmatism over faith, and who had built his legion around guerrilla warfare and precision strikes rather than religious devotion and mass conversion. Corax had never hidden his contempt for the Word-bearers' methods during the Great Crusade, viewing their slow conquest rate and emphasis on building monuments as wasteful and self-indulgent. Lorgar had tolerated this criticism with outward calm, but internally, he had marked Corax as someone who would never understand the true purpose of the Great Crusade or the deeper truths about the universe. The drop site massacre on Istvan V had been the first time the two Primarchs faced each other as open enemies rather than barely civil brothers. The battle had been orchestrated by Horus to eliminate legions that remained loyal to the Emperor, luring them into a trap where they would be destroyed by overwhelming traitor forces. The Raven Guard had been among the legions that responded to what they believed was a call to suppress Horus's rebellion, only to find themselves betrayed by forces they thought were allies. Corax had led his warriors with characteristic skill, attempting to extract his legion from the killing ground when the true scope of the betrayal became apparent. Lorgar had been present at Istvan V, commanding Word-bearers' forces that participated in the massacre. The Urizen had watched as the Raven Guard fought desperately to escape, their stealth tactics and hit-and-run strategies proving insufficient against the coordinated assault of multiple traitor legions. When Lorgar and Corax finally met in direct combat, the confrontation was brief but devastating. Corax was a Primarch who had spent his life fighting, who had led slave rebellions and prosecuted campaigns across the galaxy. His combat skills were honed through constant practice and actual warfare rather than theoretical study. Lorgar, despite his physical prowess as a Primarch, had spent more time preaching and studying than fighting, and the difference in experience showed immediately. Corax tore into Lorgar with a fury that the Urizen had not anticipated. The Raven Guard Primarch wielded a pair of lightning claws that could rend even Primarch flesh, and he used them with precision that spoke of decades of practice. Lorgar attempted to defend himself, drawing on his psychic abilities to predict Corax's movements and create barriers of warp energy, but the Raven Lord's speed overwhelmed his defenses. The claws opened wounds across Lorgar's chest and arms, cutting through his armor and the enhanced flesh beneath. The pain was immense, but more devastating was the humiliation of being so thoroughly outmatched by a brother who had always looked down on him. The fight would have ended with Lorgar's death if not for the intervention of Conrad Kurz, the Night Lord's Primarch, whose own sanity had long since fractured under the weight of his prophetic visions. Kurz attacked Corax from behind, his own lightning claws striking at the Raven Guard Primarch with the kind of vicious brutality that characterized the Night Lord's methods. Even with two Primarchs attacking him simultaneously, Corax managed to wound both before finally being forced to withdraw, using smoke grenades and the chaos of the larger battle to cover his escape. Lorgar was left bleeding and defeated, saved only by the chance intervention of a brother he barely tolerated. The encounter on Istvan V established a pattern that would repeat during later confrontations between Lorgar and Corax. The Urizen was simply not Corax's equal in direct combat, lacking both the experience and the temperament for the kind of brutal close quarters fighting that the Raven Guard Primarch excelled at. This reality forced Lorgar to avoid situations where he might face Corax alone, relying instead on superior numbers, sorceress support, or the intervention of other forces to protect him from his brother's wrath. The Shadow Crusade had brought Lorgar and Corax into conflict again, though the circumstances differed from Istvan V. The Raven Guard had been rebuilding their strength following the massacre, and Corax had been experimenting with methods to rapidly create new Astartes to replace his losses. These experiments had been corrupted by Alpha Legion infiltrators working for the traitor cause, resulting in the creation of twisted, mutated creatures rather than proper space marines. The failure of his rebuilding efforts and the realization that his own legion had been infiltrated and sabotaged had driven Corax into a rage that made him even more dangerous than before. When Corax learned that Lorgar was operating in the Ultramar sector as part of the Shadow Crusade, he led elements of his rebuilt Raven Guard in pursuit. The hunt that followed was characterized by hit-and-run attacks that exploited the Raven Guard's expertise in stealth warfare. Corax struck at Word-bearers' positions without warning, his warriors appearing from nowhere to kill and then vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. The attacks were not designed to achieve strategic objectives, but to draw Lorgar out, to force the Urizen into a confrontation where Corax could finish what he had started on Istvan V. Lorgar recognized the trap, but found himself with limited options for avoiding it. The Word-Bearers could not simply abandon the Shadow Crusade, as their orders from Horus required them to keep Guilliman occupied and prevent the Ultramarines from reinforcing Terra. Yet every day they remained in the sector, Corax's attacks grew bolder and more devastating. The Raven Guard Primarch seemed to be everywhere at once, striking at supply convoys, assassination command staff, and disappearing before Word-Bearers' forces could mount effective responses. The psychological impact on the 17th Legion was significant, with warriors who had faced demons and warp horrors without flinching now looking over their shoulders for an enemy who could kill them before they even knew he was present. The final confrontation between Lorgar and Corax during the Shadow Crusade occurred on a world whose name has been lost to Imperial records, deliberately obscured by Word-Bearers who survived the encounter. Corax had finally forced Lorgar into a position where retreat was impossible, where the Urizen had to either fight or abandon significant Word-Bearers' forces to their fate. The battle that followed was one-sided in ways that demonstrated just how outmatched Lorgar was when facing his brother without support. Corax moved through the Word-Bearers' ranks like a shadow made lethal, his lightning claws reaping a toll of Astartes' lives as he fought his way toward Lorgar's position. When the two Primarchs met, Corax did not waste time on words or dramatic gestures. He simply attacked with the clear intention of killing his brother and ending the Urizen's role in the heresy permanently. Lorgar attempted to use his psychic abilities to even the odds, summoning warp entities to distract Corax and creating barriers of immaterial energy to slow his advance. These tactics bought seconds at most. Corax tore through summoned demons without breaking stride and shattered psychic barriers through sheer force of will, backed by his physical assault. The Raven Guard Primarch's claws found Lorgar's flesh repeatedly, opening wounds that would have killed a normal Astartes and that even a Primarch's enhanced healing struggled to address. Lorgar survived the encounter only because of the intervention of the Gal Vorbak, the possessed Word-Bearers who had been transformed during the pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror. These demon Astartes hybrids threw themselves at Corax with suicidal determination, accepting their own deaths to buy time for their Gene Father to escape. Argel Tal, who led the Gal Vorbak, personally held Corax's attention long enough for Lorgar to be dragged away by his bodyguard. The cost was devastating, with most of the Gal Vorbak dying in the rearguard action, and Argel Tal himself suffering wounds that would have killed a normal space marine. Lorgar escaped with his life, but with the knowledge that he could not face Corax again without overwhelming support. The actual siege of Terra saw Lorgar's role diminish significantly compared to his influence during the earlier phases of the heresy. Much of the Word-Bearers' strength remained committed to operations outside the solar system, continuing the Shadow Crusade or prosecuting other campaigns that kept loyalist forces occupied away from the throne world. The forces that Lorgar brought to Terra were substantial, but represented only a portion of his legion's full strength. This distribution reflected both strategic necessity and perhaps a degree of caution on Lorgar's part, an unwillingness to commit everything to a single decisive battle when the outcome remained uncertain. The Word-Bearers who did participate in the Siege of Terra found their primary role was not frontline combat, but the maintenance of warp rifts that allowed demonic forces to manifest in real space. The barrier between the material universe and the Imperium had always been thinner on Terra than on most worlds, a consequence of the Emperor's presence and the psychic beacon of the Astronomicon. The traitor forces exploited this weakness, using mass ritual sacrifices and sorcerous ceremonies to tear holes in reality through which demons could pour. The Word-Bearers served as the priests and sorcerers who conducted these rituals, their decades of studying chaos giving them expertise that other traitor legions lacked. The summoning and control of demonic forces required constant effort and attention from Word-Bearer sorcerers. Demons were not simple weapons that could be pointed at the enemy and forgotten. They were entities with their own wills and agendas, beings that would turn on their summoners if given the opportunity or if they sensed weakness. the word-bearers had to maintain psychic control over the entities they brought through, binding them with names and words of power, offering them sacrifices to keep them focused on attacking Imperial defenders rather than pursuing their own incomprehensible goals. This work was exhausting and dangerous, with sorcerers dying from psychic backlash or being consumed by the very entities they attempted to control. The defensive measures that Imperial forces employed against demonic incursions made the word-bearer's task even more difficult. The Emperor himself was active in maintaining psychic wards around key locations, and his presence alone was enough to banish lesser demons or prevent them from manifesting entirely. The Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal guardians, had been trained in methods for fighting demonic entities and proved devastatingly effective at disrupting word-bearers' rituals. Sisters of Silence, humans with the rare trait of being psychic blanks whose very existence nullified warp powers, accompanied custodian forces and made entire areas of the battlefield impossible for demons to enter. The word-bearers found themselves in a constant struggle to maintain the warp rifts they had created, losing ground as Imperial forces systematically eliminated their ritual sites and killed their sorcerers. Lorgar's personal participation in the actual fighting during the siege was limited and sporadic. The Urizen spent much of his time in the trader fleet above Terra, coordinating word-bearers' forces and conducting his own rituals to support the demonic incursions. When he did descend to the planet's surface, it was typically to address specific crises or to conduct ceremonies that required a Primarch's psychic power to complete successfully. He avoided situations where he might encounter loyalist Primarchs, having learned from his confrontations with Corax that he was outmatched in direct combat by brothers who had spent their lives as warriors rather than priests. The word-bearers' contributions to the siege, while significant in enabling the demonic aspects of the assault, did not translate into the kind of glory or recognition that other traitor legions achieved. The Sons of Horus led the assault and bore Horus's banner as he confronted the Emperor. The Death Guard and Emperor's children fought their way deep into the Imperial palace, claiming territory and inflicting casualties that would be remembered in traitor histories for millennia. The World Eaters, led by the demon prince Angron, became a legend of bloodshed that terrified defenders and inspired traitors. The word-bearers, by contrast, worked largely behind the scenes, their sorcerers dying in obscurity while maintaining the rituals that made the broader assault possible. The siege's ultimate failure and Horus's death at the Emperor's hands marked the end of the traitor force's best opportunity to overthrow the Imperium. When word spread that the War Master had fallen and that loyalist reinforcements were approaching the solar system, the traitor legions began to withdraw in disorder. The carefully maintained alliance that had held them together fractured completely, with each legion looking to its own survival rather than continuing a fight that could no longer be won. The word-bearers participated in this retreat, their ships fighting their way out of the solar system alongside other traitor vessels as loyalist forces moved to trap them. Lorgar survived the heresy's conclusion, unlike some of his traitor brothers who fell during the siege or its immediate aftermath. The Urizen's survival was not a matter of martial prowess or tactical brilliance, but rather his consistent pattern of avoiding situations where he might be killed. He had not participated in the final assault on the Imperial Palace, had not been present when Horus confronted the Emperor, and had positioned his forces to facilitate retreat when the tide turned against the traitors. This caution, which might be characterized as cowardice by some, ensured that Lorgar lived to lead his legion into the Eye of Terror when the traitor forces abandoned the material universe for the relative safety of the warp. The retreat into the Eye of Terror was not a panicked flight, but a calculated withdrawal to territory where the traitor legions could rebuild, and where the Imperium would find it nearly impossible to pursue them. Lorgar led the word-bearers deep into the Eye, claiming a demon world called Sikaris as their new home. The planet had once been a human world during the Dark Age of technology, but millennia of warp exposure had transformed it into something that barely qualified as part of the material universe. Reality on Sikaris was malleable, subject to the whims of the warp powers, and the will of those strong enough to impose their desires on the planet's substance. The word-bearers established their fortress monastery on Sikaris, a structure that combined the architectural traditions of Colchis with the impossible geometries that warp corruption made possible. The fortress served as both a military installation and a temple complex, a place where the Legion could worship the chaos gods without interference, and where new generations of word-bearers could be trained in the arts of war and sorcery. Lorgar claimed the largest cathedral within the complex as his personal sanctuary, a space where he could meditate and commune with the warped powers that he had devoted his existence to serving. The Lectitio Divinitatis stands as one of history's most profound ironies, a text that achieved the opposite of its author's intentions in ways that would have seemed impossible when Lorgar first composed it. The treatise was written during the early decades of the Great Crusade, before monarchia's destruction, when Lorgar still believed the emperor welcomed worship and that spreading faith in the master of mankind's divinity served the imperial cause. The text argued systematically for the emperor's godhood, presenting evidence drawn from his abilities, his age, his role in shaping human history, and the miracles that accompanied his presence. Lorgar structured the Lectitio Divinitatis as both theological argument and devotional guide, providing believers with frameworks for understanding the emperor's nature and methods for expressing proper worship. The book's distribution began within the word-bearer's legion itself, with copies produced by legion scribes and distributed to every battle brother. Lorgar intended the text to serve as a foundation for the faith he was spreading across compliant worlds, a standardized doctrine that would prevent the kind of theological confusion and heretical deviation that plagued less organized religions. The word-bearers carried copies of the Lectitio Divinitatis with them on campaign, presenting the text to planetary governors and religious leaders as part of the compliance process. Many worlds that the 17th Legion brought into the Imperium adopted the book as their primary religious text, building their worship practices around Lorgar's interpretations of the Emperor's divinity. The Emperor's rejection of this worship and the destruction of monarchia did not eliminate the Lectitio Divinitatis from circulation. The text had spread too widely, copied too many times, and taken root too deeply in populations that had embraced it as sacred scripture. Worlds that the word-bearers had brought into compliance decades earlier still maintained their faith despite the Emperor's official stance against religious belief. The book passed from hand to hand, copied in secret by believers who refused to abandon their convictions even when imperial authorities attempted to suppress religious practice. The very thoroughness with which Lorgar had spread his faith ensured that it could not be easily eradicated once he turned against the emperor. During the heresy and in the millennia that followed, the Lectitio Divinitatis became the foundational text of the imperial cult, the state religion that the emperor had explicitly rejected, but which came to dominate the Imperium after his internment in the Golden Throne. The priests and preachers who built the imperial cult drew heavily on Lorgar's arguments, using the structure and theological framework he had created while stripping away any reference to the text's author. The ecclesiarchy, the massive religious organization that would eventually control the imperial cult, based its doctrines on principles Lorgar had established. The irony was absolute and would have amused the Urizen if he had been capable of appreciating it. The emperor, who had humiliated Lorgar for spreading worship, now existed as the object of the largest religious organization in human history, sustained by faith that followed patterns Lorgar had created. The transformation of the Lectitio Divinitatis into imperial scripture required significant editing and reinterpretation. References to Lorgar himself were removed or attributed to anonymous saints and martyrs. Passages that might suggest the existence of other divine powers were carefully excised or rewritten to emphasize the emperor's singular divinity. The ecclesiarchy scholars worked to make the text appear as though it had emerged organically from the faithful, rather than being composed by one of the arch-traitors who had nearly destroyed the Imperium. This historical revisionism was so thorough that many believers had no idea their most sacred text originated with a heretic Primarch who now dwelt in the Eye of Terror as a servant of chaos. The Book of Lorgar represented the dark mirror of the Lectitio Divinitatis, a text composed after the pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror that presented the theological framework for chaos worship. where the Lectitio Divinitatis had argued for the emperor's divinity using logic and evidence that could appeal to rational minds, the Book of Lorgar embraced revelation and direct experience of the warp as sources of truth. Lorgar wrote this new scripture over several years, working in the isolation of his chambers aboard the Fidelitas Lex, while the word-bearers prosecuted their campaigns during the heresy. The text was not composed in a single inspired session, but rather built up gradually as Lorgar processed his experiences in the eye and developed his understanding of the Chaos Gods. The Book of Lorgar began with a systematic deconstruction of the imperial truth, the philosophy that had dominated imperial culture and which Lorgar now understood as the emperor's greatest lie. The text argued that denying the existence of gods did not make them cease to exist, but rather left humanity vulnerable to their influence through ignorance. The warp powers were real, conscious entities with immense capability to affect the material universe. Pretending they did not exist, refusing to acknowledge their nature or develop methods for safely interacting with them, was not enlightenment but willful blindness that made humanity weaker rather than stronger. The emperor's atheistic philosophy served his own interests by preventing humans from accessing sources of power that might challenge his authority, but it did nothing to actually protect humanity from warp-based threats. The core theological argument of the Book of Lorgar centered on what he called the primordial truth, the concept that chaos represented the fundamental reality of the universe, and that the material realm was merely a temporary manifestation of deeper immaterial forces. This inverted the common understanding that treated the physical universe as primary and the warp as a reflection or byproduct of material existence. Lorgar argued that consciousness and emotion were more fundamental than matter and energy, that the thoughts and feelings of sentient beings had ontological priority over the physical forms those beings inhabited. The warp was not a separate dimension, but the true underlying reality, and the Chaos Gods were not parasites feeding on humanity, but expressions of universal forces that existed independent of any particular species or civilization. This philosophical framework led to conclusions that justified chaos worship in ways that went beyond simple promises of power. If the Chaos Gods represented fundamental aspects of reality, then attempting to suppress or deny them was not just futile but actively harmful. The emotions and drives that fed the warp powers, violence and ambition and desire and despair, were inherent to sentient existence. They could not be eliminated without eliminating consciousness itself. The Emperor's project of creating a purely rational, emotionless humanity was therefore impossible, and any attempt to achieve it would only create suffering while accomplishing nothing. Better to acknowledge these forces, to understand them and develop relationships with them that allowed for mutual benefit rather than the parasitic dynamic that ignorance created. The Book of Lorgar provided detailed descriptions of the four major Chaos Gods, though the text acknowledged that other warp entities existed and that the number 4 was not absolute, but rather reflected the current dominant powers in the Imperium. Khorne was described as the embodiment of warfare, violence, honor in combat, and the drive to test oneself against worthy opponents. The Blood God demanded blood and skulls, but rewarded his followers with strength and the glory of victory in battle. Lorgar's treatment of Khorne was respectful but somewhat distant, acknowledging the god's power while making clear that the path of endless violence was not suitable for all worshippers. Tzeentch received more extensive treatment in the Book of Lorgar, reflecting the Urizen's own inclinations toward knowledge and manipulation. The Architect of Fate was presented as the god of change, ambition, sorcery, and the pursuit of knowledge regardless of cost. Tzeentch offered his followers the ability to reshape reality through understanding its underlying principles, to achieve their goals through cunning and planning rather than brute force. The text warned that Tzeentch was also the god of betrayal, and that his plans often served purposes that mortal minds could not comprehend, but Lorgar argued this uncertainty was preferable to the false certainty the Emperor offered. Nurgle appeared in the Book of Lorgar as a more complex figure than the simple plague god that imperial propaganda would later portray. The text described Nurgle as embodying the cycle of death and rebirth, the inevitability of decay, and the persistence of life even in the most hostile conditions. Nurgle's gifts of disease and mutation were presented not as punishments, but as forms of transformation that freed worshippers from fear of death and pain. The Plague God offered acceptance and even a twisted form of love to his followers, embracing them in their degradation, rather than demanding they meet impossible standards of purity or perfection. Slaanesh received the most nuanced treatment in Lorgar's text, perhaps because the Prince of Pleasure's domain encompassed aspects of existence that the other gods did not fully address. The youngest of the major chaos gods was described as embodying sensation, experience, artistic expression, and the pursuit of perfection through excess. Slaanesh offered followers the ability to experience existence more fully than baseline humanity allowed, to push beyond normal limits and discover what lay on the other side of conventional morality and physical constraint. Lorgar acknowledged that this path led to extremes that destroyed many who walked it, but he argued that the alternative, a life of repression and denial, was its own form of death. The Book of Lorgar established hierarchies of demonic entities that served each of the major gods, providing names and descriptions that allowed sorcerers to summon and bind specific types of warp creatures. These hierarchies were not presented as rigid organizational charts, but rather as flexible frameworks that reflected general patterns in how demonic entities manifested and behaved. Greater demons stood at the top of each hierarchy, beings of immense power that embodied their patron god's nature in concentrated form. Below them came various ranks of lesser demons, each with their own capabilities and characteristics. The text included specific rituals and invocations for summoning different types of entities, along with warnings about the dangers inherent in such practices and methods for maintaining control over summoned demons. The theological framework Lorgar developed treated worship not as simple devotion, but as a transactional relationship between mortals and gods. The Chaos Gods required worship to maintain and expand their power, drawing strength from the emotions and beliefs of their followers. In exchange, they granted their worshippers access to abilities and knowledge that would otherwise remain beyond mortal reach. This was fundamentally different from the relationship the Emperor demanded, where humans were expected to serve without receiving anything in return except the privilege of being allowed to serve. The Chaos Gods were honest about what they wanted and what they offered, while the Emperor lied about his nature and his intentions. Lorgar's concept of apotheosis, the transformation of mortals into demon princes, received extensive treatment in the Book of Lorgar. The text presented this transformation as the ultimate reward for faithful service, a form of immortality that transcended the limitations of physical existence. Demon princes retained their consciousness and identity while gaining access to warp-based powers that made them effectively immortal and vastly more capable than they had been as mortals. The process was dangerous, and many who attempted it failed, dying or being consumed by the entities they sought to merge with, but success offered rewards that no other path could match. Lorgar used Angron's transformation as a primary example, describing how the Red Angel had been saved from death through apotheosis and granted the strength to continue fighting forever. The practical aspects of chaos worship received as much attention in the Book of Lorgar as the theological arguments. The text provided detailed instructions for constructing temples and shrines, for conducting rituals that would please the Chaos Gods, and for organizing communities of worshippers in ways that would maximize their effectiveness. Lorgar drew on his experiences on Colchis and his decades of spreading the imperial cult to create frameworks that could be adapted to different cultural contexts while maintaining core practices that ensured proper devotion. The book included liturgies and prayers for different occasions, ritual calendars that aligned with warp phenomena, and guidelines for identifying individuals with psychic potential who might serve as priests or sorcerers. The Word-bearers used the Book of Lorgar as their primary religious text, with copies distributed throughout the Legion and studied by every battle brother. The 17th Legion's chaplains, who had once preached the Emperor's divinity, now used Lorgar's new scripture as the foundation for their sermons and instruction. The book shaped how word-bearers understood their purpose and their relationship with the Chaos Gods. They were not simply warriors fighting for conquest or personal gain, but priests spreading the primordial truth, bringing enlightenment to populations that had been kept ignorant by the emperor's lies. Every battle was a religious act, every victory a sacrifice to the gods, and every world brought into chaos worship was a step toward the ultimate goal of replacing the emperor's false order with the honest relationship between mortals and gods that Lorgar advocated. The spread of the Book of Lorgar beyond the Word-Bearer's Legion occurred gradually and often through indirect channels. Other traitor legions that had embraced chaos developed their own theological frameworks and practices, but many borrowed elements from Lorgar's text even when they did not acknowledge the source. The systematic approach to demon summoning that Lorgar had documented became standard practice among traitor sorcerers. The hierarchies of demonic entities that he had mapped out were confirmed through independent experience and incorporated into the knowledge bases of multiple legions. The philosophical arguments for why chaos worship was preferable to serving the emperor found their way into the rhetoric of traitor champions who had never read the Book of Lorgar directly, but had absorbed its ideas through cultural transmission. The contrast between the Lectitio Divinitatis and the Book of Lorgar revealed how completely Lorgar's understanding of divinity had transformed. The earlier text had presented the emperor as a singular god worthy of absolute devotion, arguing that his power and wisdom justified treating him as divine even if he rejected that characterization. The later text rejected the concept of singular divinity entirely, arguing instead for a polytheistic framework where multiple gods existed and where worship was distributed among them based on which aspects of existence a worshipper wished to engage with. Where the Lectitio Divinitatis had emphasized obedience and submission to divine authority, the Book of Lorgar stressed transaction and mutual benefit between worshippers and gods. Both texts shared certain characteristics that reflected Lorgar's nature as a being who needed faith to function. Neither presented atheism or agnosticism as viable options. Both assumed that worship was necessary and that the only question was identifying the proper objects of devotion. Both were written with the absolute conviction that characterized everything Lorgar did, presenting their arguments as revealed truth rather than philosophical speculation. And both were designed to be spread widely, to serve as foundations for mass religious movements rather than as texts for small groups of initiates. Lorgar had never been content with personal faith. He needed to share his beliefs, to convert others and build communities of worship that validated his understanding of the universe. The philosophical implications of Lorgar's shift from worshipping the emperor to worshipping chaos extended beyond simple theology into questions about the nature of power and authority. The emperor had claimed to rule by right of his superior capabilities and his vision for humanity's future, demanding obedience without offering genuine reciprocation. The chaos gods made no such claims to benevolence or concern for humanity's welfare. They were honest about being self-interested entities that granted power in exchange for worship and service. Lorgar argued this honesty was preferable to the emperor's hypocrisy, that a relationship based on explicit transaction was healthier than one based on false paternalism and demands for unconditional loyalty. The concept that gods required worship to achieve their full power was central to both the Lectitio Divinitatis and the Book of Lorgar, though the implications differed between the texts. In the earlier work, Lorgar had argued that the emperor's power would grow as more humans recognized his divinity and offered proper worship, that spreading faith in the emperor would make him stronger and better able to protect humanity. The Book of Lorgar applied this same logic to the chaos gods, arguing that they grew stronger through the worship and emotional offerings of their followers. The difference was that the chaos gods acknowledged this dynamic and rewarded their worshippers accordingly, while the emperor denied his divine nature and rejected the worship that would have empowered him. This understanding of the relationship between worship and divine power led Lorgar to conclude that the emperor's rejection of religion was not just philosophically wrong but strategically foolish. By refusing to accept worship and attempting to suppress religious belief throughout the Imperium, the emperor was deliberately weakening himself while doing nothing to actually diminish the chaos gods. Humans would continue to experience the emotions that fed the warp powers regardless of whether they acknowledged those powers' existence. fear and rage and ambition and despair, would continue to strengthen Khorne and Tzeentch and Nurgle and Slaanesh whether humans worshipped them or not. The only difference was that worshippers could potentially gain something in return for the emotional energy they provided, while those who remained ignorant simply fed the gods without receiving any benefit. The primordial truth, as Lorgar conceived it, was not simply a theological claim, but a comprehensive worldview that explained the nature of reality and humanity's place within it. Chaos was fundamental, the underlying reality from which everything else emerged. The material universe was temporary and ultimately illusory, a thin layer of physical law imposed on top of the roiling immaterial forces that actually governed existence. Sentient beings existed at the intersection of material and immaterial reality, their consciousness arising from the interaction between physical bodies and warp-based souls. Denying the immaterial aspect of existence, pretending that only the physical mattered, was to deny half of what humans actually were. This philosophy had practical implications for how Lorgar believed humanity should organize itself and pursue its goals. The Emperor's project of creating a purely rational, secular civilization was doomed to fail because it ignored fundamental aspects of human nature. People needed faith, needed meaning beyond simple material existence, needed to believe in something greater than themselves. Attempting to suppress this need did not eliminate it, but rather drove it underground where it festered and eventually exploded in uncontrolled ways. Better to acknowledge the need for faith and provide proper channels for its expression, to teach humans how to safely interact with the warp powers rather than leaving them vulnerable to possession and corruption through ignorance. The Book of Lorgar presented chaos worship as a form of enlightenment, a recognition of truths that the Emperor had tried to hide. Those who embraced the primordial truth were not falling into darkness, but rather opening their eyes to reality as it actually existed rather than as the Emperor wanted them to perceive it. The mutations and physical changes that accompanied deep chaos worship were not corruption but transformation, the material body adapting to reflect the immaterial reality that actually governed existence. The madness that sometimes accompanied warp exposure was not a failure of the worshipper, but rather the difficulty of mortal minds processing truths that transcended normal human comprehension. The transformation of Lorgar Aurelian into a demon Primarch did not occur immediately following the siege of Terra's failure. The Urizen led the Wordbearers into the Eye of Terror alongside the other defeated traitor legions, establishing the demon world of Sikaris as their new fortress monastery and base of operations. The years immediately after the heresy saw the Wordbearers focused on consolidating their position within the Eye, fortifying Sikaris against potential Imperial incursions, and beginning the long process of rebuilding their strength after the losses suffered during the failed rebellion. Lorgar spent this period in meditation and study, deepening his understanding of the Chaos Gods and the nature of the warp, while his legion adapted to existence within the Eye's reality warping environment. The decision to undergo apotheosis was not made hastily or out of desperation. Lorgar had witnessed Angron's transformation into a demon prince of Khorne and understood both the power such ascension granted and the fundamental changes it imposed on those who underwent the process. A demon prince was no longer fully mortal, existing partially in the material realm and partially in the immaterium. The transformation was irreversible and carried risks that even a Primarch's enhanced physiology could not fully mitigate. Yet Lorgar also recognized that remaining mortal meant accepting limitations that would eventually lead to his death, whether through combat, assassination, or simple entropy over millennia. The Chaos Gods offered immortality to their most devoted servants, and the Urizen had proven his devotion through decades of service and the successful corruption of half the legion's Astartes. The specific timing and circumstances of Lorgar's ascension remain unclear in Imperial records, obscured by the unreliable passage of time within the Eye of Terror and the Word-bearers' deliberate obfuscation of their Primarch's history. What is known is that Lorgar underwent the transformation sometime during the centuries following the heresy's end, emerging as a demon Primarch of chaos, undivided rather than dedicating himself to any single god. This choice reflected both pragmatism and theology. Lorgar had always preached worship of all four major chaos gods rather than exclusive devotion to one, arguing that each represented essential aspects of existence that deserved acknowledgement. Becoming a demon prince of undivided chaos allowed him to draw on the power of all four gods, while avoiding the complete subservience to a single patron that characterized demon princes like Angron. The physical changes that accompanied Lorgar's transformation were substantial but less dramatic than those experienced by some of his brother Primarchs who ascended to demonhood. Where Angron had become a towering engine of violence that barely resembled his former self, Lorgar retained more of his original appearance. His form grew larger, and his features took on qualities that suggested his demonic nature, with skin that seemed to shift between flesh and something more ephemeral, eyes that glowed with warp energy, and an aura of power that caused reality to distort in his immediate presence. But he remained recognizably the Urizen, still capable of speech and rational thought, still driven by the need for faith and the desire to spread the primordial truth rather than reduced to a mindless avatar of a single god's domain. The Ascension granted Lorgar abilities that transcended his previous capabilities as a mortal Primarch. His psychic powers, which had always been considerable, expanded dramatically as he gained direct access to warp energy without needing to channel it through the limitations of physical reality. He could manifest and dismiss himself from the material realm at will, appearing on distant battlefields or returning to Sikaris without requiring conventional transportation. His presence alone could corrupt the faithful and drive the weak-minded to madness or worship. The warp responded to his will in ways it never had when he was mortal, allowing him to reshape reality on a local scale through sheer force of intention backed by the power of the Chaos Gods. Yet the transformation also imposed costs that Lorgar had anticipated, but perhaps not fully appreciated until he experienced them directly. A demon Primarch was bound to the warp in ways that a mortal Primarch was not, vulnerable to banishment if defeated in combat, or if the conditions sustaining his manifestation were disrupted. Spending extended periods in the material realm required constant effort to maintain his physical form against the natural tendency of demonic entities to dissolve back into the immaterium. The Chaos Gods who had granted him power also expected continued service and worship, their attention a constant presence that even a being of Lorgar's strength could not completely ignore or resist. He had gained immortality and vast power, but he had also surrendered the last vestiges of true independence that he might have retained as a mortal. The Word-Bearers Legion adapted its structure and organization during the millennia following the heresy to reflect both their new existence within the Eye of Terror and the lessons learned from the failed rebellion. Unlike some traitor legions that fractured into countless warbands with little coordination or shared purpose, the Word-Bearers maintained substantial unity and coherent command structures. This cohesion was not accidental, but reflected deliberate choices made by Lorgar and his senior officers about how the Legion should function in the long war against the Imperium. The 17th Legion could not match the Ultramarines' numbers or the Iron Warriors' siege expertise, but they could leverage their religious organization and ideological commitment to remain effective as a unified force. The Dark Council emerged as the primary governing body of the Word-Bearers, a group of the most powerful and experienced officers who advised Lorgar and managed the Legion's operations when the Primarch was unavailable or uninterested in day-to-day command decisions. The Council's membership varied over the millennia as members died or ascended to demonhood, but its function remained consistent. These were the Word-Bearers who had proven themselves through centuries of service, who understood both the military and religious aspects of the Legion's mission, and who could be trusted to make decisions that aligned with Lorgar's vision even in his absence. The Dark Council coordinated campaigns across multiple warbands, allocated resources among different expeditions, and maintained the theological orthodoxy that kept the Legion unified when other traitor forces devolved into chaos. The position of Dark Apostle became the primary command rank within the Word-Bearers, replacing the traditional captain structure used by Loyalist legions. Dark Apostles were not simply military commanders, but religious leaders who combined the roles of battlefield general and high priest. Each Dark Apostle led a host, typically consisting of several hundred to several thousand word-bearers, along with supporting cultists, demon engines, and summoned warp entities. The Dark Apostles had authority over both military operations and religious observances within their hosts, ensuring that every campaign served the dual purpose of advancing the Legion's strategic goals and spreading chaos worship to new populations. The religious hierarchy within each host mirrored the broader structure of the Legion, with chaplains serving under the Dark Apostles to maintain doctrinal purity and conduct the rituals necessary for summoning demons and maintaining favor with the Chaos Gods. These chaplains, called Dark Disciples or Choriphaus depending on their specific rank and function, were responsible for the spiritual welfare of the warriors under their authority. They led prayers before battles, conducted sacrifices to honor the gods after victories, and identified heretical deviations from approved doctrine that might weaken the host's effectiveness or draw unwanted attention from the warp powers. The chaplains also served as intermediaries between the Dark Apostles and the rank and file word-bearers, ensuring that orders were understood and that concerns from lower ranks reached the attention of leadership. The word-bearers maintained this relative unity through a combination of shared ideology, effective organization, and the continued presence of Lorgar as a unifying figure, even when he was not directly commanding operations. The Legion's warriors genuinely believed in the primordial truth that Lorgar preached, viewing themselves as crusaders spreading enlightenment rather than simple raiders seeking plunder or revenge. This ideological commitment created bonds between word-bearers that transcended individual ambition or the petty rivalries that plagued other traitor legions. A warrior who truly believed he was serving the fundamental forces of the universe was less likely to break away and pursue purely personal goals than one who fought only for himself. The organizational structures that supported this unity were equally important. The Dark Council provided coordination and strategic direction that prevented the word-bearers from dissolving into isolated warbands with no shared purpose. The Dark Apostles maintained communication with each other and with the Council, sharing intelligence about Imperial movements and coordinating their campaigns to achieve maximum effect. The religious hierarchy ensured that theological disputes were resolved through established channels rather than devolving into the kind of internecine warfare that weakened other traitor forces. And the continued production of new word-bearers through recruitment and transformation of suitable candidates meant the Legion could replace losses and maintain its strength over millennia. Lorgar's participation in the Long War was extensive during the first few millennia following the heresy, but became increasingly sporadic as the centuries accumulated. The demon Primarch led word-bearers' forces in numerous Black Crusades, the massive invasions of Imperial space that Abaddon the Despoiler organized to strike at the Imperium and claim territory or resources for the traitor legions. Lorgar's presence in these campaigns brought both military power and religious authority that helped unite disparate traitor forces around common objectives. His ability to summon and control vast numbers of demons made him a devastating force on the battlefield, capable of turning entire war zones into killing grounds where reality itself became a weapon against Imperial defenders. The word-bearer's role in Black Crusades typically focused on the religious and sorcerous aspects of the campaigns rather than straightforward military conquest. While other legions assaulted fortified positions or engaged Imperial fleets in void combat, the word-bearers worked to corrupt the populations of targeted worlds, spreading chaos cults and preparing the ground for full-scale demonic incursions. They conducted mass rituals that tore holes in reality, allowing hordes of warp entities to pour into the material realm and overwhelm defenders through sheer numbers and the terror their presence inspired. They identified and corrupted key Imperial officials, turning planetary governors and military commanders into unwitting or willing servants of chaos who would sabotage defensive efforts from within. The spread of chaos cults throughout the Imperium became one of the word-bearers' primary contributions to the Long War, a strategy that leveraged their expertise in religious conversion and their understanding of how faith could be weaponized. The 17th Legion deployed small teams of operatives to Imperial worlds, often disguised as pilgrims or merchants or other innocuous travelers who would not draw immediate suspicion. These operatives would identify populations vulnerable to corruption, typically among the lower classes who suffered under the Imperium's brutal exploitation, or among intellectuals who questioned the official doctrines of the Imperial Creed. The word-bearers would introduce carefully crafted heresies that appealed to their target's specific grievances and desires, gradually converting them to chaos worship through a process that could take years or even decades to complete. The cults that emerged from these efforts served multiple purposes for the word-bearers and the broader traitor cause. They provided intelligence about Imperial military movements and defensive preparations, with cultists in positions of authority or access reporting information to their word-bearers' handlers. They conducted sabotage and terrorism that weakened Imperial worlds from within, destroying infrastructure and assassinating loyalist officials in ways that appeared to be random violence or accidents rather than coordinated enemy action. And when the time was right, when word-bearers' forces arrived to assault a world that had been properly prepared, the cults would rise up in open rebellion, attacking Imperial defenders from behind and creating the kind of chaos that made organized resistance nearly impossible. The corruption of Imperial worlds through faith represented a particularly insidious form of warfare that exploited the Imperium's own religious nature against it. The Imperial Creed that had emerged from Lorgar's Lectitio Divinitatis taught citizens to have faith in the Emperor's divinity and to trust in religious authority. Word-bearers' operatives could manipulate this existing faith structure by presenting themselves as representatives of heterodox, but still technically imperial religious movements, introducing small deviations from orthodox doctrine that gradually escalated into full chaos worship. A cult might begin by emphasizing the emperor's role as a warrior god who demanded blood sacrifice, a belief that was not entirely incompatible with some interpretations of the imperial creed. Over time, this emphasis on blood sacrifice would be redirected toward Khorne, with the emperor reinterpreted as merely one aspect of the blood god, or as a false god who had been overthrown by the true powers. The Imperium's size and bureaucratic dysfunction made it nearly impossible to effectively counter this cult infiltration strategy. The word-bearers could seed thousands of cults across thousands of worlds, knowing that Imperial authorities would only detect and suppress a fraction of them. Even when cults were discovered and their members executed, the ideas they had spread often persisted, passed on through secret teachings, or embedded in local culture in ways that were difficult to identify and eliminate. A single word-bearer's operative working over decades could corrupt an entire planetary population, creating a time bomb that might not detonate until centuries after the original infiltrator had departed or died. The cumulative effect of these efforts was an Imperium that was constantly fighting internal threats, forced to divert resources from defending against external enemies to suppressing heresy within its own territory. Lorgar's personal participation in these cult-spreading operations was limited, as a demon Primarch could not easily move through Imperial space without drawing immediate attention. But he provided the theological framework and strategic direction that guided the word-bearers' efforts, and he occasionally manifested on worlds where particularly important cults had been established to lead rituals or deliver sermons that would inspire the faithful and cement their devotion to chaos. These appearances were brief and carefully orchestrated to minimize the risk of Imperial forces responding quickly enough to threaten the Primarch, but they had tremendous impact on the cults that witnessed them. Seeing Lorgar in person, experiencing the overwhelming presence of a demon Primarch who radiated power and absolute conviction, transformed casual cultists into fanatics willing to die for the cause. The pattern of Lorgar's activities during the Long War showed a gradual shift from direct military leadership to a more contemplative and withdrawn existence. The early millennia after the heresy saw the demon Primarch actively commanding word-bearers' forces, participating in Black Crusades, and personally leading assaults on Imperial worlds. But as the centuries accumulated and the long war settled into a grinding stalemate where neither side could achieve decisive victory, Lorgar's direct involvement decreased. He began spending more time on Sikaris, retreating into the massive cathedral he had claimed as his personal sanctuary, and engaging in meditation and study that could last for decades without interruption. This withdrawal was not a matter of cowardice or disinterest, but reflected Lorgar's nature as a being driven by the need for understanding and faith rather than simple violence. The demon Primarch had never been primarily a warrior, and the endless cycle of attack and retreat that characterized the Long War did not satisfy his deeper needs. He had proven the truth of chaos through his actions during the heresy, had demonstrated that the Emperor's vision was flawed, and that the primordial truth offered a better path for humanity. The specific tactical details of individual campaigns mattered less than the broader spiritual struggle, and Lorgar believed his time was better spent deepening his understanding of the Chaos Gods and developing new theological frameworks than personally leading every assault on Imperial territory. The temple on Sikaris, where Lorgar conducted his meditations, was a structure that defied conventional architecture, built from materials that existed only partially in real space, and decorated with iconography that shifted and changed based on which Chaos God was currently ascendant in the warp. The central chamber stood hundreds of meters tall, its walls covered in scripture written in languages both human and demonic. Lorgar would spend years at a time in this chamber, seated on a throne of brass and bone, while he contemplated the nature of divinity and the future of the galaxy. His physical form would sometimes fade to near transparency during these meditations, becoming more warp entity than material being as he immersed himself in communion with the Chaos Gods. The word-bearers who remained active in the Long War continued their campaigns during Lorgar's periods of withdrawal, following the strategic direction provided by the Dark Council and the theological framework established in the Book of Lorgar. The Legion's operations did not require the Primarch's constant oversight because Lorgar had successfully instilled his vision and methods into the entire organization. Every Dark Apostle understood the Legion's purpose and could make decisions that aligned with that purpose without needing to constantly consult with their Gene Father. This was both a strength and a potential weakness, as it meant the word-bearers could function effectively without Lorgar, but also meant they might drift from his original vision if he remained withdrawn for too long. The rumors of Lorgar's recent awakening in the Era Indomitus, the period following the opening of the Great Rift, and the return of Roboute Guilliman to active command of Imperial forces, suggested that the Demon Primarch recognized the changing strategic situation and understood that his direct involvement might again be necessary. The Great Rift had torn the Imperium in half, creating a massive warp storm that made travel and communication between the two halves of Imperial space nearly impossible. This catastrophe represented both threat and opportunity for the forces of chaos, as it granted them unprecedented access to the material realm, while also destabilizing the Imperium in ways that could be exploited. Guilliman's return and his efforts to stabilize and reform the Imperium posed a direct challenge to everything Lorgar had worked to achieve, as the Lord of Muck-Crag represented the kind of rational, organized opposition that was most dangerous to chaos corruption efforts. The specific details of what prompted Lorgar to emerge from his meditation remained unclear, obscured by the word-bearers' typical secrecy about their Primarch's activities and the unreliable nature of information coming from the Eye of Terror. Some reports suggested he had received visions from the Chaos Gods, indicating that his direct involvement was required for events that would reshape the galaxy. Others claimed he had simply grown bored with contemplation and decided to return to active warfare. Still, others suggested that the return of Guilliman had awakened old hatreds and rivalries that Lorgar could not ignore, that the Demon Primarch could not allow his brother to rebuild the Imperium without challenging him directly. Whatever the reason, intelligence reaching the Imperium indicated increased word-bearers' activity coordinated in ways that suggested high-level strategic direction rather than the independent operations of individual Dark Apostles. Cult uprisings on multiple worlds occurred simultaneously in patterns that implied central planning. Word-bearers' forces appeared in sectors where they had not been active for centuries, conducting operations that seemed designed to draw Imperial attention and resources away from more critical defensive positions. The Dark Council issued pronouncements and theological declarations that referenced their Primarch's guidance in ways they had not for millennia. All of these signs pointed toward Lorgar taking a more active role in the Long War, though whether he had fully emerged from his seclusion or was simply providing more direct oversight while remaining primarily on Sikaris remained unknown. The prospect of Lorgar returning to active command of the Word-bearers represented a significant threat to the Imperium, not because the Demon Primarch was an exceptional military commander, but because his presence would unite and inspire chaos forces in ways that few other figures could match. Lorgar was the architect of the heresy, the Primarch who had corrupted half the legions Astartes and nearly destroyed the Imperium during humanity's greatest civil war. His theological frameworks and cult infiltration strategies had weakened the Imperium from within for 10,000 years. If he chose to fully commit himself to the Long War again, bringing his abilities as a Demon Primarch and his millennia of experience to bear on the current strategic situation, the consequences could be catastrophic for Imperial defensive efforts already strained by the Great Rift and the countless other threats facing humanity in the era Indomitus. The Imperium of the 42nd millennium exists as a monument to irony, its foundations built upon the exact opposite of everything the Emperor sought to achieve when he created the Primarchs and launched the Great Crusade. The Master of Mankind had envisioned a rational, enlightened civilization where humanity would be free from the shackles of religious superstition and the predations of warp entities. He had designed the imperial truth to starve the Chaos Gods by denying them the faith and worship they required to maintain their influence over the material realm. Yet the Imperium that persists 10,000 years after the heresy is the most religiously zealous human civilization in recorded history, a theocratic nightmare where faith in the Emperor's divinity is enforced with the same brutality that he once used to suppress religious belief. This transformation represents Lorgar's ultimate victory, though it manifested in ways the Urizen could not have anticipated when he first penned the Lectitio Divinitatis. The text that Lorgar wrote to glorify the Emperor as a god became the foundational scripture of the imperial cult after the Master of Mankind was interred in the Golden Throne following his confrontation with Horus. The priests and preachers who built the ecclesiarchy drew directly from Lorgar's theological arguments, using the frameworks he had established while carefully erasing any mention of the text's author. The billions of prayers offered daily throughout the Imperium follow patterns that Lorgar created. The temples and cathedrals that dominate imperial worlds are built according to architectural principles he developed on Colchis and refined during the Great Crusade. The very concept of the Emperor as mankind's divine protector, the central tenet of imperial faith, originated in Lorgar's visions and his absolute conviction that the Master of Mankind deserved worship. The supreme irony extends beyond simple theological victory. The faith that Lorgar spread, which the Emperor destroyed Monarchia to suppress, may be the only thing keeping the Master of Mankind alive. The Golden Throne sustains the Emperor's physical form through technological means, but the nature of his existence after 10 millennia of entombment remains unclear even to the Imperium's most learned scholars. Some theorize that the countless prayers and devotions offered by imperial citizens provide psychic sustenance that maintains the Emperor's consciousness, that the faith Lorgar championed actually feeds the being he once worshipped and later betrayed. If this theory holds truth, then Lorgar achieved something remarkable. He forced the Emperor to become the god he always denied being, sustained by the very worship he rejected and punished. The imperial cult's dominance creates strategic advantages for chaos forces that Lorgar recognized and exploited throughout the Long War. A population taught to have absolute faith in religious authority becomes vulnerable to corruption when that authority is subverted or when alternative interpretations of doctrine are introduced. Word-bearers operatives have spent 10,000 years infiltrating imperial worlds and twisting the ecclesiarchy's teachings toward chaos worship, introducing heresies that appear superficially compatible with the imperial creed, but which gradually lead believers toward the primordial truth. The process works precisely because Lorgar understands the psychological and spiritual mechanisms of faith better than anyone except perhaps the Emperor himself. He created the template that the imperial cult follows, which means he knows exactly how to corrupt it. The Imperium's response to internal heresy has created a self-perpetuating cycle that serves chaos interests even when individual cults are discovered and eliminated. The Inquisition and other imperial agencies tasked with rooting out corruption operate with such brutality and paranoia that their methods often create more heretics than they destroy. Entire planetary populations are declared tainted and subjected to exterminatus, their billions of deaths feeding the chaos gods, even as the Imperium claims victory over heresy. The constant fear of corruption and the draconian punishments for even suspected deviation from orthodoxy create exactly the kind of despair and resentment that makes populations vulnerable to chaos promises of freedom and power. Lorgar's understanding of how faith operates, both as a source of strength and as a vulnerability, shaped strategies that continue to weaken the Imperium millennia after he retreated into contemplation. The Word-bearers Legion remained one of the most active and dangerous traitor forces throughout the Long War, maintaining a level of cohesion and strategic focus that many other legions lost as they fractured into competing warbands. The Dark Council's coordination of Legion operations ensured that Word-bearers' campaigns served broader strategic objectives rather than devolving into raids for plunder or personal glory. The 17th Legion's forces participated in every major Black Crusade, providing the sorceress expertise and demonic summoning capabilities that transformed conventional military operations into apocalyptic invasions where reality itself became a weapon. Their cult infiltration network spread across thousands of imperial worlds, creating internal threats that forced the Imperium to divert resources from external defense to internal security. The opening of the Great Rift in the early 42nd millennium, the massive warp storm that split the Imperium in half, represented the kind of catastrophic event that chaos forces had been working toward for 10,000 years. The rift emerged from the 13th Black Crusade's success in destroying the Cadian Gate, the network of pylons that had stabilized the Eye of Terror and prevented it from expanding. With those ancient structures destroyed, the barrier between material and immaterial reality collapsed across a vast swathe of the galaxy, creating a permanent warp storm that made travel and communication between the two halves of Imperial space nearly impossible. The strategic implications were devastating for the Imperium and correspondingly beneficial for chaos forces that could navigate the rift or use it as a staging ground for invasions. The Word-bearers moved quickly to exploit the opportunities the Great Rift created. Dark Apostles led their hosts into the Imperium Nihilus, the half of Imperial space cut off from Terra by the Rift, where Imperial authority had collapsed in many regions and worlds, struggled to survive without support from the broader Imperium. These isolated worlds proved exceptionally vulnerable to corruption, their populations desperate enough to accept any offer of aid or protection, even when it came from obvious servants of chaos. Word-bearers forces established footholds on dozens of worlds throughout Nihilus, building cult networks and demon-summoning infrastructure that would take centuries for the Imperium to root out even if they managed to restore order to the region. The plague wars that erupted in Ultramar shortly after the Great Rift's opening saw Word-bearers' participation alongside Death Guard forces, though the 17th Legion's role was secondary to Mortarian's personal vendetta against Guilliman. Word-bearers' sorcerers helped maintain the warp rifts that allowed Nurgle's demons to manifest in real space, and Dark Apostles led cults that rose up to support the Death Guard invasion from within Ultramar's worlds. The campaign demonstrated the Word-bearers' continued effectiveness as force multipliers who enhanced other traitor legions' operations through their sorceress and cult infiltration capabilities. The fact that Guilliman ultimately repelled the invasion and stabilized Ultramar did not eliminate the damage the word-bearers had inflicted, as the cults they had seeded would continue operating long after the Death Guard withdrew. The corruption of Nihilus proceeded according to patterns that Lorgar had established millennia earlier, with word-bearers' forces focusing on long-term conversion rather than simple conquest. Dark Apostles understood that a world genuinely converted to chaos worship was more valuable than one simply occupied by traitor forces, as true believers would continue serving chaos interests even without direct military presence. The process required patience and careful attention to local conditions, identifying which chaos god's domain would most appeal to a given population's specific circumstances and grievances. A world suffering from plague might be converted to Nurgle worship through promises of acceptance and freedom from fear of death. A world with a strong warrior culture could be turned toward Khorne through appeals to honor in combat and the glory of violence. The word-bearers adapted their approach to each target, using the theological flexibility that Lorgar had built into the Book of Lorgar to maximize their effectiveness. The return of Roboute Guilliman to active command of Imperial forces represented both threat and opportunity for the word-bearers and the broader chaos cause. The Lord of Macragge brought organizational skills and strategic vision that the Imperium had lacked since the Heresy, implementing reforms that addressed some of the systemic weaknesses that had made the Imperium so vulnerable to internal corruption. His Indomitus Crusade reclaimed hundreds of worlds and restored Imperial authority to regions that had been isolated or overrun during the chaos following the Great Rift's opening. The Primaris Space Marines he introduced, enhanced Astartes created using improved gene seed techniques, provided the Imperium with military forces capable of matching traitor Astartes on more equal terms than standard Space Marines could achieve. Yet Guilliman's return also created opportunities for Chaos forces to exploit. The Lord of Macragge's reforms challenged entrenched Imperial institutions, particularly the Ecclesiarchy and the Inquisition, creating political conflicts that distracted from military operations and provided openings for word-bearers' operatives to expand their influence. His attempts to implement rational governance and reduce the Imperium's religious extremism echoed the Emperor's original vision in ways that made him vulnerable to the same accusations of heresy that the Imperial cult's most zealous adherents had leveled against previous reformers. Word-bearers' propaganda exploited these tensions, spreading rumors that Guilliman was a false Primarch or that his return was part of a chaos plot to undermine the Emperor's true church. The strategic situation in the era Indomitus remained fluid and dangerous for both sides, with neither the Imperium nor Chaos forces able to achieve decisive advantage. The Great Rift continued to divide Imperial space and provide Chaos forces with unprecedented access to the material realm. The Imperium's military strength had been reinforced by Primaris Space Marines and the resources Guilliman's reforms made available, but the territory that needed defending had expanded as the Indomitus Crusade reclaimed lost worlds. The Word-bearers and other traitor legions continued their infiltration and corruption efforts, seeding cults that would remain dormant for decades or centuries before activating to support future invasions. The Long War had entered a new phase, but its fundamental dynamics remained unchanged from the patterns established during the heresy itself. Lorgar's character represented one of the great tragedies among the Primarchs, a being created with immense gifts who used those abilities to damn the galaxy, because he could not exist without faith to give his existence meaning. The Urizen possessed psychic abilities that might have rivaled Magnus if properly developed, oratory skills that could inspire millions to devotion, and an understanding of human spiritual needs that made him uniquely qualified to guide humanity toward genuine enlightenment. Yet these same gifts became instruments of corruption because Lorgar's fundamental nature required him to worship something greater than himself. He could not simply exist and pursue goals based on rational calculation or personal desire. He needed to believe, needed to serve a power he considered divine, needed to spread that faith to others as validation of his own convictions. The Emperor's rejection of Lorgar's worship created a wound that could never heal because it struck at the core of what the Urizen was. a being who needed faith to function, could not accept that his god denied divinity and rejected worship. The destruction of Monarchia did not teach Lorgar humility or redirect his devotion toward more acceptable expressions. It shattered his faith entirely, creating a void that demanded filling with something equally absolute. The Chaos Gods offered what the Emperor had refused: acknowledgement of their divine nature, acceptance of worship, and rewards for faithful service. That these entities were parasitic and corrupting, that serving them would lead to damnation in any conventional moral framework, mattered less to Lorgar than the fact that they were honest about what they were and what they demanded. The nihilistic zealotry that characterized Lorgar's post-heresy existence reflected the transformation from idealistic faith to something darker and more desperate. The Urizen who had unified Calcus through genuine conviction that he was serving humanity's best interests became a demon Primarch who spread corruption knowing it would destroy the very populations he converted. The difference was not a matter of moral development or philosophical growth, but rather the replacement of one absolute faith with another. Lorgar had believed the Emperor would save humanity and lead it to a glorious future. When that faith proved false, he embraced the opposite conviction with equal fervor, that humanity's salvation lay in accepting chaos and abandoning the Emperor's lies. The content of his faith changed completely, but the psychological need for absolute belief remained constant. The comparison between Lorgar and his brother Primarchs revealed his unique position among the traitors. Horus had fallen through ambition and pride, believing he deserved the power and recognition the Emperor had denied him. Angron had been broken by trauma and the Butcher's nails, reduced to a being of pure rage who could barely think beyond his next kill. Mortarian's resentment toward the Emperor stemmed from specific grievances about how his discovery had been handled and his hatred of psychers and sorcery. Fulgrim's corruption emerged from his pursuit of perfection and his inability to accept any limitation on his experiences or achievements. Each of these Primarchs fell to chaos for reasons specific to their individual circumstances and psychological weaknesses. Lorgar stood apart because his fall was not about personal grievance or psychological damage, but about the fundamental incompatibility between his nature and the Emperor's vision. The Urizen would have remained loyal if the Emperor had accepted his worship, would have served faithfully as the Imperium's high priest spreading faith in the master of mankind's divinity. His corruption of the other legions was not revenge for personal insult, but genuine conviction that he was saving his brothers from serving a tyrant who lied about his nature and intentions. The heresy itself, the galaxy-spanning civil war that killed billions and damned countless souls, emerged not from Horus's ambition, but from Lorgar's patient decades-long effort to reveal what he considered truth about the Chaos Gods and the Emperor's hypocrisy. This made Lorgar arguably the most successful of the traitor Primarchs in terms of damaging the Emperor's vision for humanity's future. Horus nearly killed the Emperor but failed, and the Warmaster's death ended his direct influence on galactic events. Angron became a demon prince of Khorne, but remained essentially a weapon, a being of pure violence without the capacity for strategic thought or long-term planning. The other traitor Primarchs achieved various degrees of success in their campaigns, but none fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization. Lorgar transformed the Imperium into a theocratic state that embodied everything the Emperor had fought against, forced the master of mankind to become sustained by the worship he had rejected, and created corruption networks that would weaken the Imperium for 10,000 years. He was not the strongest traitor Primarch or the most infamous, but measured by the metric of how thoroughly he destroyed what the Emperor tried to build, none of his brothers matched his achievement. The legacy Lorgar left extends beyond the word Bearer's Legion or even the broader forces of chaos. Every Imperial citizen who prays to the Emperor follows patterns Lorgar established. Every ecclesiarchy priest who preaches the master of mankind's divinity uses theological arguments Lorgar developed. Every temple built to glorify the Emperor reflects architectural principles Lorgar refined. The Imperium exists as a twisted mirror of what Lorgar wanted to create during the Great Crusade, a galaxy spanning religious civilization dedicated to worshiping a god emperor. The only difference is that the emperor became that god through 10,000 years of suffering, rather than through willing acceptance of his divine nature, and the worship he receives comes from populations kept ignorant and desperate rather than genuinely enlightened believers. The Urizen achieved a victory more complete than any military conquest could provide. He proved that humanity needed faith, and that attempts to suppress that need would fail catastrophically. He demonstrated that the emperor's vision of rational, secular civilization was incompatible with human nature, and that trying to impose it would only create the conditions for chaos corruption. And he forced the Imperium to become the very thing the emperor had tried to prevent, a theocratic nightmare where religious zealotry and superstition dominated every aspect of existence. Whether Lorgar takes satisfaction in this outcome, or whether his demon Primarch existence has progressed beyond such mortal concerns remains unknown. But the galaxy he shaped through his faith, his betrayal, and his patient corruption stands as his monument, a testament to the power of belief and the catastrophic consequences when that belief is rejected by those who should have understood its necessity.